Good morning, everybody who's there in Leeds, and welcome to all of those who are online or watching this event today. I'd like to welcome you to the FSA's March board meeting. Due to a personal matter, I really regret that I'm unable to be there in person in Leeds today. And I'm also joined online by Lord Blencathra and Justin Varney. For the same reason, I must also give my apologies for the second half of today's meeting. I am sorry that this is necessary, and I'm very grateful to board colleagues for their understanding. I'd also like to thank our new FSA Deputy Chair, Tim Riley, who has kindly agreed to chair the meeting after the break. As you'll know, Tim was appointed as Deputy Chair at the start of the year, and of course is very familiar with how these meetings run, having been a board member for the last 4 years. I'd like to very formally congratulate him on his appointment, but also to thank Mark Rolfe for his work as the interim Deputy Chair in the latter half of last year, and in particular for chairing the Business Committee. On the subject of board members, I'm also pleased to confirm, as we published on the website yesterday, that Fiona Gately and Lord Blencathra have both been reappointed for a second term of 3 years as of the 1st of June this year. So beyond that, this board meeting will continue as usual. And as ever, we invited questions in advance of the board meeting, which relate to papers on the agenda today. This 2 items have attracted quite a bit of attention, in particular precision breeding, where we've had 35 questions to the board, but also the foodborne disease paper, where there are a further 8 questions. All of these questions have been published on our website, and board members have had an opportunity to read them and to consider them in advance of today's meeting, so they may well refer to these questions during the discussion. I've also asked our executive colleagues to try to address some of these questions in their own remarks wherever that's possible, but regardless of any discussion we may have, we will of course provide a written answer to every question in due course. So with those introductory comments, let's move into the usual business of the day. And can I first start by asking whether any members of the committee have any new external interest to declare, or indeed any interests that relate directly to items which are on the agenda today? See any comments, and that's also a bit of a test as to whether I can see people putting their hand up online, but let's trust it's working. So the next thing is for me just to ask if there are any items of additional business that people want to raise at the end of this meeting. Okay. So we move on to consider the minutes from the last meeting, and our board members content to accept these as an accurate record of our December discussions. I can see a few nods, so I will take that as accepted, and then we'll move on to the matters arising. If you just cast your eye down the various actions, you'll see that action 1 and 4 relating to the ABC programme and the work of the NFCU are both ongoing. We'll hear more about, and the ABC programme will be coming to the June board. We're going to hear more about items 3 and 5 in relation to regulated products as part of today's agenda, and we'll also the matter in relation to traceability for precision breeding during the agenda. So I suggest we take any comments relating to those items when we get to that paper. I don't know if there are any points that members particularly wanted to raise. I did wonder whether you were content with the information that had been provided on the trusted trader schemes, or whether you wanted me to ask Anjali to say a little bit more on that, or whether that's sufficient. People seem content, thank you. I should, I suppose, at this point note that I'm really delighted that the documentary checks at the border have begun since our last meeting, and we very much look forward to the physical checks starting. Okay, so if are there any other issues arising that people wanted an update on? If not, we will press straight on to the next item on the agenda, which is my report to the board. And as ever, there's no paper for this, it's just an oral report. The first quarter of this year, I would say, has been more focused than usual on internal activities within the FSA. We held a very productive board retreat in January, where we were able to think a little bit about the priorities for the year ahead and indeed beyond that. And since then, I've spent a lot of time talking to our team, to stakeholders, to Food Standards Scotland, and indeed to ministers about our regulated products service, and also discussing the plans for reform, which we're going to cover later today. I've also attended the small ministerial group chaired by Baroness Neville-Rolfe to discuss the progress on the BTOM implementation. Last week, I was delighted to speak at a couple of FSA engagement events. One was organised by the team in Northern Ireland to promote our new standards for healthier and more sustainable food in vending, which also I think was a great opportunity to highlight our very productive collaborations with the Department of Health, with DERA, and also with Invest Northern Ireland. I also spoke at a workshop for the growing group of agricultural attachés who are based in the UK at a meeting which was organised by our international team. We were able to tell them a little about some of the FSA work, particularly in relation to incidents, to food crime, import controls, and I think it was a great opportunity to really talk about the FSA's growing role in supporting global trade. I do think that these attachés are a very, very valuable network for us. I've also been out and about at some large external events. These are all listed in my engagements. I think I just want to draw particular attention to the National Farmers Union Conference and the City Food Lecture, which have both had very interesting presentations and have also been great opportunities to meet others working in the food system. I'm really struck by the fact that there is a growing consensus that we need a long-term plan for food that's good for people, good for the planet, and good for the economy. And I've been making the case that high food standards and a strong independent regulator are absolutely crucial to maintain consumer trust in food. There is, of course, much talk of an upcoming election in the air, but the work of the FSA is going to be absolutely vital, regardless of who it forms the next government. And I know that any government will want to see that the way we deliver food controls is proportionate and is also efficient. I've been very clear to the FSA team that we need to continue to show that we can do our day job brilliantly, as well as being agile enough to respond to any changes in the external context as and when they happen. So that's really, I think, the state of play as I see it from my role as your chair, and very happy to take any questions that you might have. I perhaps should also note at this stage of the proceedings that we're required through our standing orders to announce the date of the board meetings for next year. And I'd like to note that the dates have been published for 2025, have been published on our website. If any of you want to scribble them down, although I think the board members have had them by email, they'll be the 26th of March, the 18th of June, the 17th of September, and the 10th of December 2025. A bit of forward planning. So I'll stop there, and as I said, very happy to take any questions or comments on the things I've been doing over the last few months. No comments. Okay, I shall continue what's beginning to feel like a monologue, but I hope that you are all with me. So at this point, I would usually turn to the Chief Executive and ask Emily to give her report. But instead today, that report will follow immediately after the break. And instead now we're going to move directly into some of the individual and substantive policy papers, which require particular discussion or indeed decisions from the board. And so the first of those is the executive governance review. And so if I could ask people to turn to that paper now, and I can see that officials, that Sam is coming to the table. Sam's our Deputy Director of Strategy and has really been leading a lot of the thinking on this paper. So this first paper really builds on a commitment that we made in December when we had the annual governance report to the board. And at that time, we said that we would bring together all of the FSA's existing government documents into a single board operating framework. Mostly, this doesn't change anything, but it does, I think, by bringing them together, provide clarity and makes it much easier as part of our commitment to openness and transparency to demonstrate the way in which the board operates and to give some clarity about the ways of working. The team have been working with me, with the Deputy Chair and the Chief Executive to develop particular guidance for officials, which is set out here in a sort of illustrative scheme of delegations. This is not intended to be exhaustive or prescriptive, but what it does do is to indicate those areas in which the board has effectively delegated responsibility to the executive to carry out certain functions. And I think that having this helps everybody to know where the bounds of responsibility lie and will help us to work effectively and more efficiently together to deliver the FSA's objectives so that they're done in a timely manner, but also by the executive, but also that the board can be assured of what is being done in its name. So I think probably the best thing to do is for me to hand over to Sam, who, as I said, has been leading and drafting this, and he might summarise the paper, and then I'll be interested in your comments as to whether we've got the balance right between the responsibilities of the board and those of officials. Sam, thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And before I start, I should say a huge thank you to Christy Lindsay and the team for all of the work they've done in preparing the board paper and the underlying documents ahead of today's discussion. The board is asked to agree the board operating framework as a central guide to the FSA's governance structures as covered in paragraph 1.1 of your paper. As Susan highlighted, this brings together all of our existing governance documents into one place. This is both helpful for staff to understand how many of the things in the FSA plug together, but also supports the board's ability to hold the executive to account. A full version of the operating framework is in Annex B of the paper. As paragraph 2.3 lays out, the only new part of the board operating framework is a scheme of delegations, which you will see in Annex A. This is a high-level guideline to help officials understand the distinctions between the type of decisions taken by the board, those that are usually delegated to the executive, and those that are reserved specifically for the accounting officer. The principles within Part 3 of the scheme of delegations contain examples of how this could work, but it is clear that officials must exercise their judgment in individual circumstances, and that the board always retains the right to take the decisions themselves. The scheme is designed to sit alongside and complement other existing documents, such as the board terms of reference, and this can only ever be a guidance to decision making. As Susan mentioned, the context surrounding a decision, as well as the type of decision itself, will ultimately determine where that decision is taken and who is consulted or informed about it. And then following this discussion today, there'll be further work undertaken by the executive as outlined in section 3.3. Further updates on the progress of that work will be given back to the board in December at the annual governance update. Thank you. I'll pass back to Susan to chair any questions.
Thank you, Sam. That was remarkably succinct. As I said, myself, Tim and Emily have looked at this carefully as this work's been developed. I think it is important that we all remember in the end, the board is the FSA, but to work efficiently, we have to leave many of the day-to-day operations to the executive. But I think this scheme of delegation should better help everybody to understand where decision making lies and provide greater clarity, in particular on those matters where the board wants to take a more substantive role. I have been very keen in the steer that I've given to officials that we don't try to set out a comprehensive list of specific topics or actions, because I think there'll always be one missing, and then we'll have a huge discussion on writing the principle before we actually take the action. So what this paper tries to do is to really set out a framework that needs to apply when decisions are made. But as Sam says, every single decision is made in a particular context. We have a similar document for managing incidents, which the board have looked at previously. And I think what that's demonstrated is that this overarching framework is a helpful guide to decision making. I think in relation to this board operating framework, this is also going to become more and more important in our post-Brexit role as we encounter more and more areas where the FSA is in more of a policy-making role or providing specific advice to ministers. And we need to be very, very clear where those decisions are being made within the FSA. So what I'd say is I think this is our best shot at it, but there's always room for improvement. And I'm very keen to hear from the board, both about the general concept of this document, but also matters of detail or detailed principle. I don't want to wordsmith this now. Members can provide that fine detail later, but the overarching principles I'd like to get some agreement on today. So this is an opportunity for somebody to say something, and let's check that I can see who is putting their hand up. Mark, I think you're first out of the blocks.
Thank you, Susan. I'd just like to test the system really and make sure it's working. Just a couple of points, if I may. The first one, in the paper, it says that the scheme of delegations is not binding. And I'd like to explore a little bit more about what that means. My nervousness around that is in our role as an enforcement authority, and particularly when we're exercising enforcement powers, actually a clear and fixed delegation of those powers from the board through Emily to the officers involved is really important and is something that could be challenged if we were ever to be challenged in court. So if we suggest that that's not binding, just makes me a little bit nervous around the opportunity for challenge in those kind of criminal enforcement spaces. And my other point is a really minor one in that I think in the terms of reference, and I might have got this the wrong way round, but one of the committees, either ARAC or the business committee, includes a term which is that the deputy chair serves on the other committee, and I think it's in the wrong place. I think we've got one committee suggesting membership of the other committee in the terms of reference. So I think it says in the business committee that the deputy chair will be a member of ARAC, and I think that should be in the ARAC terms of reference.
Thank you. That's well, we can obviously check that detail. I totally agree with you. So let's just make sure we've got that correct. We'll come back to the not binding point in a moment. Any other comments from colleagues? Maybe whilst you're thinking, Sam, do you want to just comment on the not binding issue? And then David, I'll come to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So I think the point on the not binding thing is that delegation to officials is done largely through the Act itself. So the officials can act on behalf of the board in that case. I think where we say in here it's not binding is largely related to the fact, as we said, that it has to be guidance because different decisions will need to take place in different places, given the context around what we're making. I think specifically on enforcement, there are specific roles where enforcement occurs, and the work we need to do around a scheme of delegations that deals with the internal executive of the FSA and where those decisions make should flesh that out. So I can take your point on enforcement, but I think what we try to frame in here is more general decision making, and there are specific bits of enforcement that enables officials to act and therefore should act appropriately in the event of a challenge and things like that. I don't feel I've answered your question that well, Mark, actually.
Do you mind if I just come back? Because I think the clarity around the delegation of enforcement powers needs to be, if this is our scheme of delegations, the top level one needs to be really clear. That's all I'm saying. And that bit is set and is bound, in effect.
Thank you. That was very clear, and let's just take that away and make sure we've got that just right, Sam. David.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I'm content with the paper. I think it's a very good it's a very good analysis of the situation and what we should be doing. I'm looking at the principles for when the chair or board should be consulted and principles for when the chair or board should be informed. I agree with those entirely. All I would say to officials is, please be flexible. We now live in a media frenetic world, even when there isn't a general election approaching. And some decisions or some issues which may come along, which officials may have dealt with routinely over the years, suddenly take on a high political profile or a ministerial interest or a media interest. And in those circumstances, the chair or the board should be informed, and then the chair or the board may then want to be consulted on the decision flowing from it. So the 6 principles are absolutely right, but please keep in the back of your mind the things which were normally routine in the past and you didn't need to tell the board or the chair about may suddenly explode in this, as I say, media frenetic world. Thank you.
I think that's a very sensible caution, David. And I should say that, I mean, of course, what these principles are meant to do is to outlive any one individual and to be a firm guide. But I think, Emily, I really value the way that I am kept in touch, and we have, we have a regular weekly catch up, but we actually have many other catch ups outside of that. And I feel very content that I do hear about what I'd call emerging issues or things which might emerge at a very early stage. And I do think that's important. And then, of course, through our weekly emails to the board, I guess try to keep the board informed of that as well. So I think the system is working well at the moment, and I really thank Emily and other officials for that. But this is meant to safeguard it for the future and establish the principles. I thought I saw that Anthony had his hand up, but now it seems to have disappeared. But Anthony, did you want to come in?
Yes, Susan, I did. Thank you. We discussed this paper at the Northern Ireland Food Advisory Committee last week, and everybody was very supportive of it. They thought it was excellent, and they thought the delegation, the scheme and delegation would be really helpful. One of the questions that they did pose was how the scheme might be communicated, engaged with in terms of staff, so that staff fully understand it as well in terms of what their roles are. And just from an audit point of view, are there any plans for any third-party certification of the framework going forward? Thank you.
And then I think Margaret had a point as well, and then I'll come back to Sam on both of those.
Thank you, Susan. Mine was just about the point you raised earlier about keeping those grey areas. In other words, there'll be times when you've got to go for the common sense approach. And I think there are areas here which aren't very clear. Under, for example, Annex A, CEO responsibilities, you talk about food policy and advice to ministers at paragraph 4, which is the headline. And then it actually just refers to giving information to or keeping public authorities informed. And I wondered whether that really did mean just ministerial departments or you go wider. My view is that you just keep that a little bit unclear and you do what the common sense thing is at the time.
Thank you. Any other comments that I have that I've missed? If not, Sam, can I just turn to you? So I think the questions are around communication to the executive. I think that's a really important point. Third-party audit. Margaret's points, I think we can tidy up offline and check back with her later, except perhaps the very specific one. Do you want to pick those up?
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Anthony. So from a communications point of view, we have a plan to raise this with staff down through BDG and management change to help them understand how this fits together over the coming months. And we plan to run a quick evaluation with staff about how well they understand it towards the end of the year. So when it's that time to bed in and people get their head around it. We don't have any plans to get it assessed by a third party, but it's something that I think we can ask our internal audit team to look at and understand how it's functioning. And if you want something with ARAC to bring back and have a discussion on how it's working, then we're happy to help facilitate that if you want it and ask about it. So I think, sorry.
Sorry, Sam, I was just going to say that I think it is good practice just to have it certified by an external entity, just to say it is up, it is working. It may actually form part of the audit process anyway, in terms of the NAO looking at schemes of delegation, but I just think it's always good to have checked it before somebody else checks it for you.
Yeah. Emily, did you want to come in on that point? I just saw your hand pop up.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to remind the board that I think it's every 3 years you come and have your own governance reviewed, which we did, it's nearly 2 years ago now, isn't it? So you may be due for one soon, and that might also be another space where this can be checked.
Yep, that's a good point. Rhian, I saw your hand pop up. Sorry, I missed you earlier.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a small point. So WFAC discussed this paper last week and very content with it. Just to knit together, though, the Annex B, where you mentioned the Welsh Food Advisory Committee, it's a small point, but if we could note that it's chaired by the board member for Wales, I think that'll just connect in the same way as we do for NIFAC, just to complete the picture. Thank you.
Very good. So I think that what we've heard is really broad support for the board operating framework, and I think we should agree to adopt that as really our sort of central guide to our governance structures. I suggest, Sam, that we circulate it round the board for any detailed editing or to pick up on those sort of fine points of wording that Margaret and Rhian have mentioned before we just absolutely sign that off. In relation to how we evaluate or audit this, I think the idea that we should look at or think about this again in December when we have the annual governance review. By that time, as you mentioned, Sam, you'll have done some internal communication, so we can just think about how all of that, how that's bedding in and make a decision. I think there are a number of options in terms of evaluating it. One would be that we ask ARAC to look at it. Second is Emily's suggestion that potentially this can be picked up in the board effectiveness review, or we might decide that we want to do something bespoke. But I suggest we make that decision in December when we do the annual governance review. Does that sound reasonable? So I look forward to a little bit more work from the executive, basically on fleshing this out, on communicating it, and then we'll hear how that's going in December. But thank you again to you, to Christy and the rest of the team. I think, as ever, these documents are really the end, sort of partway through a process, and the conversations that it's inspired, I think, have been very helpful in their own right. So I think it's doing its job already. Thank you. Okay, so we'll now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is a discussion about the regulated products service. This is a topic that we have discussed a number of times recently, both at the board and indeed at the business committee. And this paper presents the proposals for the start of the reforms that we want to make for the regulated products service. As the paper points out, this is a system that we inherited from the EU, and I think it's become clear to us that it really isn't fit for purpose. The executives in the Food Standards Agency and indeed in Food Standards Scotland, who share responsibility for this service with us, are doing the best job they can given the difficulties. But I think the board has been very clear that the process does need reform and that these proposals are an important first step. As well as setting out two key legislative reforms, the paper presents the preliminary findings of the board's subgroup on regulated products. This was the group we set up at our last meeting to look in more detail and to work with the executive to really work out what can be done within the current regulations. And I'd like to thank Mark Rolfe, who has chaired this subgroup. I'm also very grateful to the joint working that's taken place, particularly with Food Standards Scotland over this and their representative on the subgroup, but also with our officials and with governments in Wales and Northern Ireland. I've discussed this paper with the Chair of Food Standards Scotland, Heather Kelman, also with Minister Ledson and Minister Nagel, who are responsible for this policy area in England and Wales respectively. So there has been a huge amount of work, thinking, conversations and discussions that's gone into this. I'm going to suggest that we take this paper in two parts. Firstly, just to start with the specific proposals in relation to renewals and statutory instruments, and then we'll have a bit of discussion on that. And then I suggest we move on to talking about the recommendations from the subgroup. So we've got two specific proposals where we're talking about how we move forward on those, and then we'll have some propositions for what comes next. And I'll just remind you that we decided at the last board meeting that we would hold the discussions on the long-term, more substantive reform until our June board meeting. So whilst we need to be thinking ahead to that, today we're talking about the shorter-term changes that we can make. So I can see that Peter Quigley, who's our Deputy Director of Regulatory Services, and Chris Rundle, who heads up the Regulated Products Risk Assessment, have both come to the table. I want to thank them both and their teams for the work that's gone into this. It has been a period of really intensive discussion within FSA, at the same time that they're both actually trying to get on with running the service. So it has put particular pressure on the system, and I really do recognise that, and I know that board colleagues do too. So Peter, as I said, can we just start off by just talking about the first part of the paper, and then we'll have a short discussion on that, and then come on to the subgroup later. Over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and I really appreciate those warm words, and I want to share that with everyone watching in the team and across the agency working with Food Standards Scotland for all the work that's been done in this area. So I'll give a quick overview to maximise time for board comments. So board members will recall that in December we agreed some priorities for bringing forward legislation in the short term. So firstly, on renewals, we have 3 regimes where products require a renewal every 10 years. So that's feed additives, smoke flavourings and GM food and feed. And we therefore propose to bring them into line with the other 9 regimes whereby approval provides a permanent authorisation. And secondly, for all regulated products, we intend to remove the terms of authorisation from legislation and instead establish an official e-register. So this will negate the need for statutory instruments for each individual authorisation. It will streamline the process by which authorisations come into force after ministerial decisions across the UK. And so the board is invited to comment on our proposed initial reforms. Susan's talked about the engagement that she's already had with ministers on this, and we intend to bring these forward in advance of a general election.
Thank you, Peter. Another one that was very short and to the point. Thank you. So we discussed the possibilities of these 2 specific reforms at our last meeting, and the board was generally supportive. I think the progress that we've made has been to establish that we are able to use the powers available to us under the retained EU law bill to make these changes, subject, of course, to the necessary parliamentary approvals. In my discussions with ministers in England and Wales, they were generally supportive of what we wanted to do and absolutely recognised that the strain the regulated products system is under. They also recognised that whilst removing renewals would be a substantive change from what happens in the EU at present, the process of statutory instruments is something that we effectively introduced when we brought this back to the UK. When products are authorised in Europe, they then essentially come into force immediately. So I think that this is mostly a sort of tidying up arrangement. So can I invite comments from the board on these 2 proposals to either affirm your support, which we gave in principle at the last meeting, and to raise, or obviously any counter views, but also if there are any specific details that you think we need to be aware of, then this would be a good chance to mention them. Tim.
Thank you. I think the first thing to say is I welcome the recommendations and would support them. And I think it's just worth recording that we are in a different position than we were, in that we are now one of the UK's market authorisation authorities, which is something that obviously in the context of Europe we hadn't that role before. And I think that it's important to recognise that this is an area not just now for dealing with the issues that we have in hand, but also what we do in the future as well. Because the system of approvals perhaps didn't anticipate what is changing in the manufacture of foods, particularly around novel foods. And so this is a problem or an issue or an opportunity, depending on how you want to look at it, which we need to lean into in the future. So I won't do a spoiler alert on things that we will need to discuss at future board meetings, but I do believe that what we do now is absolutely critical to how we shape this service on behalf of the UK of how food authorisation, food market authorisation in the future. So strongly recommend and support the proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And I think you're right to say what we're doing now is in many ways to enable us to have the space to create a better system later. David.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is an excellent paper, and the case for change made out in paragraphs 2 to 8, or 2.2 to 8, are just impeccable. It's excellent. On the 10-year renewals, I would remove them. We must scrap this. And in future, any risk assessment should be based on the risk, not just because it's up to 8 years or 10 years in this particular case. And that frees up 22% of our workload. And as Tim says, it gives us a little bit more breathing space to deal with the really new, exciting products coming along, where we will need to study them in detail. And I'd also scrap the statutory instrument route. It came about accidentally and rather ironically, because politicians in both houses said, we must make sure we retain all EU law. We can't have the government sneaking things out and getting rid of EU law. So we've accidentally caught ourselves in the trap of having to have a statutory instrument to approve things, which when we were in the EU, we didn't have to do. So that should go. It doesn't diminish in any way the standards and the quality control. So I'm totally in favour of these two proposals.
Thank you. And I'm going to take the absence of comments from others as being general assent to this. I mean, I think that it's important to say that this does not alter ministerial decision making. Ministers will still make the decisions. It's just we remove the administrative bit on the end. And on the subject of renewals, I mean, David reiterated the importance of this. Renewals constitute about a quarter of the caseload at the moment, but actually looking ahead in the next couple of years, I think it's within the next couple of years, they will account for up to half of our caseload. There's a huge number of renewals pending. And I think it isn't. The other thing to note is, we have multiple systems, processes for authorisation, and there's only 3 in which we require renewals. And I think that there's a sort of equity issue that when things have been authorised as safe, then they should be on the market and we should review them if the evidence changes. But that should be the same across the board, and rather than having 3 specific regimes where we have a different standard. So, Peter, if I could just ask you just to confirm to me what the next steps of this are. I understand that we will have a formal consultation. As you've heard, the board is pretty clear in its view that we should move ahead with this. So could you just explain to me a little bit more about what we hope to get out of the consultation?
Yes, exactly. I think the key thing on the consultation is that we want it to be really visible, really meaningful engagement with key consumer groups and interested stakeholders. So we'd be looking to, subject to the ministerial agreements that Susan, you referred to, and that needs to happen in England, Wales, and with colleagues in Food Standards Scotland and the Scottish ministers. So subject to those agreements, of course, we move into consultation hopefully later in the spring. We have that really meaningful engagement exercise, and then we'd look to bring forward the legislation and debates in the summer, ideally in advance of the summer recess. Of course, all of this is subject to any kind of announcements around a general election, but assuming that doesn't take place in the next sort of 3 to 6 months, then we're optimistic that we can get this done in advance of the election.
Great, thank you. And I have to say, I think time is of the essence, because as every week and month goes by, we're still having to process these things. So, okay, that's good. Very straightforward. So I look forward to that consultation going out. I'm assuming that will have to be the end of this month, very beginning of April. So stakeholders who are interested in this area should look out for that being released. And if you have a particular interest, then please do contact us. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second part of this paper, which is the board subgroup and their recommendations. So I said previously my thanks to Mark Rolfe for chairing this, but also I want to thank Anthony, Rhian and Hayley, who gave up quite a bit of time at pretty short notice to contribute to this work since our last board meeting. It has been very helpful to receive your recommendations, and I know that those recommendations in a way are the sort of tip of the iceberg, because there was a huge amount of discussion and working over a number of other options that went ahead of that. Every quarter, when we have the business committee meeting, we review the performance of the regulated products service. And so as part of that, we did have some discussion about these recommendations, and that'll be noted in the report from the business committee later. We have not discussed whether we should accept or reject the recommendations, but we did discuss whether these proposed actions would take us far enough to sustain the service ahead of more substantial reforms that we want to bring forward when we have when the next government's in place. So this is about what we can do now. And I'm going to hand over, I think, probably to, I think maybe Mark, do you want to speak briefly about what the subgroup have done, if I haven't already stolen your thunder on that? And then perhaps we will hand over to Rebecca Sudworth to summarise the proposals. Rebecca's our Director of Policy and, is already at the table. But Mark, do you want to speak first?
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I just, if I may, wanted to echo your thanks to my board colleagues, but also in particular to thank the officials, the FSA officials who have engaged with the subgroup from across the FSA, producing information for us at quite short notice and in some detail. So just to place on record my thanks, and hopefully my colleagues' thanks for that effort. Colleagues will have seen the recommendations from the subgroup. The first one around active caseload management, what I wanted to make clear is that, as Susan's already mentioned, this is the short term, what we can do in the short term, and the aspiration here is to make sure that consumers can access foods that are going through this system, and that the innovation in the food industry is not delayed simply by the system. The active caseload management in recommendation 1 is the game changer, in our view, in the short term. And some of that will involve doing things like pausing the current workload on renewals, where our aspiration is to remove that workload in the sort of short to medium term. Pausing it doesn't mean it goes away. So if we are not successful in that aspiration to remove the renewal requirement, actually we will still have to deal with those renewals. But those products, with the exception of a very small subset, are lawfully on the market. They can stay on the market. Consumers can continue to benefit from them once the application for renewal is made. I didn't want to go through in detail all of the other recommendations. Colleagues will have read and seen them. Some of them you may look at and think, actually, these are good management practice that we should just have in place anyway. Particularly, I refer to recommendations 3 and 4. They are, but I think it's important that the board clarifies our expectations in this space, and that's why those recommendations are there. I think, Susan, that's all I wanted to say in terms of the subgroup, but obviously I'm happy to take questions, but I know Rebecca will want to say something as well.
Rebecca, shall I hand over to you at this point?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I've just got a few more points to add, and just to echo my thanks to Mark and the work of the subgroup and the officials who've worked on this. As Mark has said, this is about ensuring better outcomes for consumers. It's about making the current system work better and more efficiently. At all times, we'll work within those principles that have been set out by the board, and we've provided those again in the paper. The board agreed this as the overarching set of principles for all of our reforms in this area. Clearly, the first principle is that we will continue to protect public health, and nothing that we do in terms of our caseload management will compromise that. And just to emphasise the other points about implementation, that clear communication with applicants and stakeholders is going to be essential. We are working on a detailed implementation plan. And finally, in order for these proposals to be effective and to deliver the efficiencies that we want, we know that we will have to do them on a 3-country basis to make sure that the system works smoothly across both England, Scotland, Wales, and also to take into account any impacts in Northern Ireland. So we will be doing that as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I mean, I can't emphasise enough that it's important that we don't leave any stone unturned in looking for improvements and efficiencies in the current process, while in order to get us to the place where we can have this longer term reform. I think the subgroup's identified places where we can take a much firmer grip on our processes and caseload management. So there are perhaps 2 issues. One is the caseload management. And then one is doing what we do more efficiently. And I think we need to keep in mind that what we're trying to do here is to focus resources in a way that makes the system as a whole work better. Individual applicants all want their one to be approved tomorrow, but as a board, we need to take a more strategic view about what will make the overall system better. So before I open this up for discussion, I should emphasise these are outline recommendations from the subgroup. And I'm keen to hear the board's view on those. And I think that at the very least, what we will want to do is to ask officials to give us a much more detailed implementation plan. What I want to see is what we think the likely impact of this will be. We've seen some estimates of what it will do to the caseload. For example, once we've taken out renewals and once we free up a bit of capacity. But I want to have a bit more assurance on how we are going to make the system of authorising products more efficient. And I think that speaks to Mark's point about overhauling our processes within the FSA. I understand that since we came out of the EU, there's been a lot of learning that's had to go on in the team. People have been upskilling and becoming confident and familiar with this process. But we now, a couple of years in, really need to be operating this in a much more efficient way. I've been closely involved in this and feel quite passionate about it, as you can tell. So I'm going to hold myself back and invite comments from other board colleagues. I guess focused initially around the recommendations, and then when we know how we feel about those, we can then consider whether we think that's sufficient or whether more needs to be done. Who wants to kick this off? Maybe I could ask Anthony and or Rian to give us comments from WFAC and NIFAC, because they've had an opportunity to discuss this already. So if I could maybe take those 2 first, and then I see that Margaret and Hayley are going to come in after that. Rian, do you want to tell us about WFAC?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, WFAC considered the regulated product paper last week, and are very supportive of everything we've just discussed here that's presented. So the prior part about renewals and statutory instruments. And we looked at the recommendations from the subgroup, which I was part of, which I really enjoyed being part of, actually. It was great to get under the skin of the topic in more detail. And WFAC advise me they find them very pragmatic, very sensible, and absolutely necessary. So fully supportive of all of those. And I guess WFAC's messaging back to me is that we should be bold. I think we all have an appetite to be bold in this space. And so, Susan, to your last point about what's next and what we need to think about in June, I think I have full support from WFAC to think really quite widely on that topic, and to look at ways to really improve the system or in an order of magnitude. I think there was an appetite to see that delivery plan. I think we all want to see the delivery plan and to see that active caseload, the impact on the active caseload of all the things mentioned. So yeah, very, very supportive, and I think I'll probably leave it there.
Great, thank you. Anthony, anything from NIFAC?
Unfortunately, the paper wasn't ready when NIFAC met, but we had done a themed discussion on regulated products in January. And the view of NIFAC was that we're entering a period of real innovation going forward, and we need a system that is fit for purpose going forward. They were very happy with the directions of travel. Being on the subcommittee, I was able to tell them what the recommendations were likely to be, where we were going. So they were very, very supportive of that. Just generally, I think we should recognise this is a very complex and difficult area. It's not straightforward. There's been an awful lot of work put in, both by Rebecca and her team, in terms of the work that they've actually done. I think we should recognise that. And actually, the subcommittee did a lot of hard graft as well in terms of getting onto the skin and into the detail. So I think we've really pulled it apart. I think the recommendations are grand. We should definitely go for them. And I think anything we can continue to do to reduce the bureaucracy and actually speed things up is where we're all headed for. The one thing that NIFAC did flag up and they're keen to try and avoid, but it's just life in Northern Ireland, and that's divergence, and trying to make sure that we don't get too far out of step on a number of areas, because it just adds more complexity to manufacturers and retailers in Northern Ireland. But other than that, very supportive, and very supportive of the proposals going forward.
Thank you very much. Margaret.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, absolutely supportive. I think it's really sensible on renewals, not to have unnecessary renewals, as long as we're sure that the initial ones are watertight, and on streamlining for ministers, very, very sensible. But just one other key message that I'd like to draw out and see at the forefront of all our thinking on this, which is we will be, in fact, we are already being lobbied politically and by industry, and these are views which of course we need to hear and we need to consider, but at the forefront we need to make sure that the top priority is going to be that this is in the instruments, this is in the interest of consumers, and consumers have to be there right at the very top. This is what it's all about. I think we have to be bold in our future thinking, but that's for another day. I have two questions. One is a wider question, which is, given that this is getting quite a bit of publicity, given that there could be reputational risks and what have you, I wondered if, Emily, as Chief Executive, you're putting an extra eye on this, what type of role you're taking overall in keeping this on the straight and narrow and making sure we're going in the right direction. And then I have a very specific question, which I don't expect a totally specific answer to, but just a general one, which is somebody around the table in this has already mentioned GMOs in relation to renewals. And I think it's a 20% figure of the feed additives and GMOs make up 20% of renewals. I think we need to be very clear about what the sort of percentage is amongst that 20%, because I don't think just saying GMOs and feed additives amount to the same thing.
Okay, Hayley, you just have your hand up. I think it's disappeared. Have we covered your points?
No, I think I'm struggling to get the hand up and then down.
Okay,
right,
so we'll go now.
Feedback on this mic. I haven't got anything else on. I'll just move that away. Sorry? Yeah, I mean, I didn't...
Okay, why don't we go to David while somebody sorts your microphone out? David.
Thank you, Chair. Another excellent paper, and I congratulate Mark and the subgroup for the suggestions they've made here. On paragraph 4.3, I agree that let everything with current approvals continue. It is in the interest of consumers that we make these changes, so we don't get bogged down in reviewing old safe products, but we can look at some of the exciting new ones coming on the market. On 4.22 on public consultation, I agree entirely it must be proportionate. In my opinion, we in the FSA do too much consultation for too long. in Parliament, in the Delegated Powers Committee I chaired, we had sort of three principles. If an organisation was changing its internal rules and it didn't really affect the consumer or stakeholders, we didn't need to consult. The organisation did not need to consult. You just told everyone. If you were changing rules to diminish the burden on the consumer or their stakeholder, then a consultation was preferable for a short time, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. However, if you were changing rules which increased the burden or made them do things which would add to their costs, then a full consultation of at least 2 months or 3 months was desirable. And we think that's the view the courts would take as well in any judicial review. So I suggest those are three principles, what kind of principles we should adhere to when we're looking at going out to consultation. And my brief comment on our last consultation on scrapping the 10-year rule, if we do a 3-month consultation, we will miss the deadline for laying an SI before the July 23rd recess. So moving on from public consultation, I'm delighted to see that our 4 countries seem to be working in harmony in this, and Scotland seems to be on board as well. And I do take Anthony's point that we want as little divergence as we possibly can, particularly in Northern Ireland. And the final point I would make is on 5.1, learning from other foreign regulators. Now, let's be absolutely clear on this for anyone listening. We would not, even if we thought a country had a wonderful regulatory system and we liked what they did, we would not implement and rubber stamp their approvals. We would want to peer review it. And I hope we'd come up with a list of countries whose regulatory systems we found preferable or we trusted more, so we had less work to do in it. But learning from other countries, we can possibly I don't mean short circuit, we can shorten our regulatory approval system if we adopt some of the proposals from other countries and peer review them before implementing them. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to say we're agreed on renewals and SIs, so I don't want any more discussion about those. On the recommendations, I think let's focus on the recommendations as they stand before us for a moment, and then I do want to talk about what else. And I think the point about how we use other regulators' opinions is an important one, and I would like to hear some wider comment from the board on how far we should go down that route. But quick comments specifically on the recommendations. Hayley, you're next.
Mine was about other regulators' opinions, but for God's sake, right.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you then, Hayley. I'm going to come back to you. Fiona, was yours on the recommendations?
Yes, it was. Thank you, Susan.
Okay,
just a couple of short points. On the recommendations, we're talking about the active management of products in the pipeline, which are looking to be categorised where they can. My request is only that we don't put certain products into a siding and forget about them if we're waiting on other bits of scientific information to come through and help us to make a decision. So that's the first request. Then the other on point 5, 4.5, is back to the challenging issue of resourcing the process. This comes up very regularly. I think it would be helpful in June if we could have some kind of summary of what resources are going to be required, but taking into account the efficiencies that you can now bring in with the changes that we're approving today. But other than that, it's a good paper. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Tim, was your comment specifically on the recommendations?
It was, and it's just to say this, that I think what's proposed, particularly around the active case management and indeed the other recommendations, but let's just focus on the active case management, is entirely consistent with what other known regulators would do in both prioritising based on evidence, risk and opportunity. And in terms of what we develop and provide in a service to the public, that should be something that we encapsulate in whatever we do in the future as well. So again, this is something we're doing now to provide context to how we become an effective market authorisation body in the future. So I think that has good reference and is certainly something that we should proceed on. And in terms of the other aspects around public consultation and so on, having a process with firm deadlines. Again, this is about having transparency and being open and being able to withstand scrutiny from whichever quarter, so that we're providing a robust but effective and high confidence service. So I would strongly recommend that.
Emily, I can see you wanted to come in. Was that in response to Margaret's specific question about your role or about the recommendation?
Yeah, it was responding to Margaret. So just to your question about what role I was taking in relation to regulated products. So it's one of the priority areas that I focus on. Susan, I agree, my priority areas most quarters. And so there are sort of two different ways of engaging on performance management. I particularly focus on capacity building. So I've been supporting Rebecca to make sure we have sufficient resource or as much as resource that we can put into both the policy risk management side and then also into CERD. So some of the decisions that I've taken in the last few weeks have related to business planning and how many posts can be in those directorates next year. I've also authorised some additional consultancy to support Rebecca in terms of performance delivery, looking at our operating model, process mapping and KPIs. And then on the reform side, so this set of propositions and then the reforms that are being worked up to bring you in June, and then the reforms you just talked about for statutory instruments and renewals. In effect, I act as the final editorial control on what propositions come to the board in these board papers, and I also have been engaging with the subgroup. I've largely tried to leave Rebecca and Mark to the subgroup, but I have gone to some bits of some of the meetings. And then I find myself often challenging officials on our risk appetite and whether we can be bolder in terms of the propositions. So, for example, I've had conversations with officials on the role of consultations and on our legal risk appetite. And then when it comes to press engagement and stakeholder engagement, I've been advising Rebecca and others on that too.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I can confirm Emily and I have both been leaning into this pretty hard over the last few months, and will continue to do so. So what I'm hearing is total support from the board for the recommendations that have been set out in principle, and I think we should adopt these. But what I'm also hearing is a real desire to have some more tangible detail. And I think that we do need a sort of delivery or implementation plan which tells us far more about how this is going to work. So we need some more detailed plans on how will we approach public consultation and how will we prioritise. If there's a suggestion in the first recommendation that we do some prioritisation in this active case management, what are the principles for doing that? As I think somebody mentioned previously, we need to be very clear about that. We need to engage with stakeholders about what this might mean for them, and we do need to understand in some detail, at least looking ahead to the next year, what the impact of all these changes is going to be on what we can expect to deliver. So this is not just about how many cases we have on board, but what can we expect to deliver in terms of output and the resource implications of that. We need to do this with urgency, and so I'm going to ask colleagues on the board if rather than delaying this until our June board meeting, whether you would be happy for me to take responsibility for basically receiving that, I would say within the next month, and really pressing that forward. We will of course report it to you in the June board papers so that it's clear to you and to the public what has been decided, but I don't want to leave this hanging for another 3 months. And what in fact I'd suggest is that I think if we get that plan in place, that I sign that off on your behalf, and then the subgroup has finished its business now, and thank you for that, but I don't want to continue that. But I think what has been helpful in having the subgroup is it's kept up the momentum between the board meetings. And so I think we probably, I think I'm going to ask for a sort of monthly report between now and the next board meeting on how things are progressing. We can share that with the board, and then we'll report that. The business committee will obviously keep an eye on the performance management as we go forward, and there will be a substantive paper on regulated products at the next board meeting. So I'm thinking and talking at the same time, but for clarity and for the minutes, what I'm proposing is I sign off an implementation plan within a month, that we then have monthly updates on how things are progressing. The business committee will review it at their meeting in June, and that the paper at the June board meeting will put into the public domain the decisions we've made about how to take forward these recommendations, and at that time, we'll also talk about the longer term reform plans. Is that a reasonable summary of how we handle these recommendations? What I want to go on to do is to talk about what else, because what is abundantly clear to me is, whilst these recommendations are great and they're very, very helpful, I do not think they will be enough. And I think there is I suspect there's some more things that can be done between these immediate things and the longer term reform. David's also already referred to using other regulators' opinions, so I want to return to that topic and see what those interim measures might look like. I can see that Mark and Rebecca have both got their hands up. Mark, given you chaired the subgroup, it would be helpful to have your reflections, and then I'll turn to Rebecca to really summarise, to get her sense of whether that is a reasonable plan of work for the next couple of months. Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I'll be very brief. The what you've set out in terms of next steps for the recommendations are exactly what I had in mind. So I would fully support that sort of course of action, with the expectation actually that progress is monitored at the business committee and then reported to the board.
Great. So, Rebecca, does that sound a reasonable plan to you?
Yeah, that all sounds very sensible, Susan, and really happy with the board's support, and as we all are keen to move on and start implementing the changes. I just had a couple more points to add, if that's all right. I'm conscious Margaret asked us a specific question about the renewals and what was in the caseload, and I can just put that on the record. So we have 104 renewals currently in our system, of which 83 are feed, 13 are GMO, and 8 are smoke flavourings. So that illustrates the very high proportion we have of feed renewals. And as Susan said earlier, we expect that to increase substantially in the coming years if we don't make changes, because there are many hundreds coming up for renewal. So this change will really make a difference to us. And then finally, as we consider what next, we can come on to talk about other regulators' opinions, but also a reminder that there is a potential further opportunity under the powers in the retained EU law or assimilated law act, because there is a sort of second wave, if you like. So there may be opportunities for us to remove further steps which we think are not proportionate and are hindering our ability to deliver a good system for consumers. So we have been considering that as well.
That's really interesting, and well, it's a useful reminder, Rebecca. I sort of did know that, but we've talked about the rule bill less of late, so I had forgotten it. So I think just in the next 5 minutes before we wrap up this item, I suppose what I'm looking to the board for is comments on the use of other regulators' opinions, but also any suggestions or thoughts about what else we might do in this sort of middle ground between the things we've absolutely agreed and we're going to consult on versus the long-term reform. Any comments? I mean, I think at this point, it is really worth remembering the points that Tim made at the very beginning, that we're in a really different space for the kinds of new products that are coming to market, the kind of technology, the sort of merge of food and biotech, and everything we do really needs to be pointing towards what might be quite a different way of authorising these things in the future. Justin.
Thank you, Susan. I think just on that point of other regulators, apologies, I think it is important we look beyond Europe as well, and keep a kind of broad line of sight to the range of these. And as you say, the food technology is changing at such a pace, but also changing in new markets. in a way that I think we haven't seen before. So I think, and I assume and I take for granted that the officials have kind of almost done a risk assessment of other regulators and how they stack up, and that's part of the process of considering whether those other regulators' opinions are taken, and part of that peer review process in the step. But I think the other thing, and this question really, which Angela may have a thought on, is around how this mirrors into the free trade agreement element of our international relations. Now we've left the EU as well. So there's a kind of element of that I think will need to be considered in this.
Thank you. So I've got Rhian, then Hayley.
Thank you, Chair. So three points really from having turned this topic over a lot at WFAC. So the first is on other regulators' opinions. WFAC sort of brought that into the discussion really before it was tabled quite some time ago in papers. And I think there is a level of comfort there using other regulators' opinions as part of our risk assessment process, but very much, I think it was David who mentioned it some moments ago, as part of that as a peer review exercise. So looking at those opinions, taking them in the round with our own expertise and our own assessment as part of the evidence base. Not least because the UK is world leading in our science. We're perfectly able to assess the risk, but bringing in if there's a time efficiency there, we should take it as part of the round. So supportive of that. But other things we've talked about are around the consultation process, and I think we are quite supportive. Well, it's half a step back. So from the Wales perspective, it's absolutely crucial that in any consultation process we have enough time to get all the views that are there to be had. So as a principle, if we shorten a consultation period routinely, which there's support from WFAC, we absolutely have to make sure we focus to raising awareness of that consultation prior to the consultation opening, so that we're really priming the stakeholders that care about the topic to make sure they can feed in. But we've talked about an 8-week consultation period and running those in parallel with our risk assessments in the authorisation process rather than serially, because there is a sense perhaps we've fallen into doing things serially when we could be doing things in parallel. So consultation, I think we should definitely talk about at a future board. And then finally, from the Wales perspective, we have a very large proportion of smaller businesses. Some of them are truly innovative and will be looking to engage with this authorisation process in the future. And I think for them, as well as the bigger organisations, the more we can do to improve the quality of their applications in the first place, the better placed we'll be to expedite them through the process in its entirety. So we must talk at a future date about how we support good quality applications going in at the front end of the process so that they get validated faster. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hayley.
Very gingerly. No, it's still not working. Oh my God. Okay.
It's working absolutely fine, Hayley.
It's not this end. It's a bit... Okay, whatever. It's not even that good a point. On the other regulators' opinions, I know what... No.
Okay, you can always feed things in outside of the meeting, Hayley. So Fiona.
Thank you, Susan. Just a couple of points on the other regulators' opinions. I support what Justin was saying about looking internationally and also to have in mind trade considerations. The question is whether there are going to be learnings in that process as we look at other regulators' opinions in how nimble stroke agile or perhaps even cavalier they might be in the way that they make some of their decisions. And then this again is slightly for the longer term process, whether there is any scope to work with other regulators on common areas of interest to actually look at how some of the science behind regulatory approval could be developed.
Thanks, Fiona. I just note we previously had, we have commissioned an external review on the sort of international landscape in relation to regulated products. So we have got that to fall back on, and we should maybe dust that off and look again at some of the suggestions in there. I can see that Robin's waiting to come in, and I will do that in just a moment, but I'm going to let Tim make the last comment from the board now.
Thanks, Susan. Well, very briefly, I think if we can expedite the process around other regulators' opinions by taking into account their source evidence, their opinions and risks, then it's only common sense, and I would suggest good practice to do so, whether or not in the future we actually have a cohort of regulators that would merit, if you like, trusted status, is something we'd have to develop and challenge over time. And on the other point around engagement with industry, I think there is an important issue, and Rianne's just raised it, around the spectrum of different businesses that with which we would engage. And maybe there are opportunities to think about whether or not we would actually have a revenue generating end of service which would provide support selectively and graded to the ability of different industries to have a scientific support service to help them navigate that process without bias to their particular proposals, but to the generality of process. And that would be, from an industry perspective, a good investment. But that's certainly something we can sketch out and think about perhaps in the future.
Thank you. Robin.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, I just thought it might be useful just to set out, of course, that the science that goes into our regulatory decisions is already completely international. We draw on the evidence base wherever it is. And indeed, many of our scientific advisory committee members sit on regulatory committees for other countries and vice versa. So just to sort of put on record that we're already doing that at the science level, notwithstanding what we might therefore do at the risk management level later on. Thanks.
And Chris, did you want to add to that? Chris Rundle?
Yes, thank you. Just adding to Robin's point and picking up Fiona's comment, when we use other regulators' assessments, we are reviewing the evidence base when we go through those assessments and checking is that in line with the data that we have available to us, and would we make a similar decision based on that process? So if somebody else has already done the hard work for us, we can follow that through into our own assessments. That's something we're doing already, but it's something we want to pull through more and learn from as well. So there's that longer term aim we've spoken of, but in the shorter term, building that into our process and expediting those things through the process as well. We've also started on other regulators' assessment work, and that is coming through, and we will also be, and that opens up further routes through risk assessment, so we don't have one route, we can do more things in parallel, which is the aim for progressing more things at a greater pace.
Great, thank you, Chris. So I'm going to draw this discussion to a close. I think that officials will have heard very strong support from around the board for the use of other regulators' opinions. And when we come back in June, I'd really like to see some detailed proposals about how we might take that forward and what we think the likely impact of that will be on our outputs. So I think that is really important. I also want to see some proposals about what other things we might do. Rebecca referred to the possibility that there will be another legislative opportunity coming up, and I want us to know what it is we're going to be pitching for at that point. So that's, if you like, a sort of midway batch of actions. And then, of course, in June as well, we're looking for the outline, the sort of, green paper, I suppose, as to what wider regulatory reform might look like. That's a lot of work, but I think it's important to see these as three parallel tracks, although they relate to endpoints at different points in time. We've got the immediate things, the renewals and the SIs. We've got the interim things, other regulators' opinions and anything else we can do. And then we've got the long-term reform. So they've got three different time horizons. But the really important thing that I want to emphasize is that work on all three needs to continue now and work in parallel. These can't be sequenced in time. They need to be worked on in parallel. And in June, we will see well, you'll see the delivery plan that I've already agreed, that I'm going to agree between meetings for the short-term things. We'll see specific and detailed proposals for other regulators' opinions and anything else we can do to improve our efficiencies. And we'll see the outline for the more fundamental reform. That's a lot of work, but I think that this is a huge opportunity for the FSA to do something that will be good for consumers in the UK, but I think will also be looked at with real interest by regulators around the world. I mentioned I'd been at the Agricultural Attaché meeting last week, and several countries were interested in hearing more and discussing our plans in relation to regulated products, because they're aware in their own countries that there are similar issues. So I think there is an opportunity for the UK to really, set a new way of doing things, which is grounded in our excellent science and with our long history of making careful, considered, but proportionate risk management decisions. So whilst this is hard work, I absolutely recognise that. I think it is a tremendous opportunity for the FSA and indeed for the UK. So I think when the going feels tough, I think we need to remind ourselves that this is an incredibly exciting time and a real opportunity for us to make a difference. I've been summarising as we go along in the various sets of actions, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat those again, but I just want to cast my eye, as it were, around the table to make sure that board colleagues feel comfortable that we've given this paper a good going over and that we've set a very, very clear expectation of both our ambition and the timeliness and the urgency with which we need to take forward this work. Okay, thumbs up from David, so we're doing well there. Good. Okay, so thank you to Rebecca and her team, to Peter Quigley and to Chris Rundle, who have been with us today. Thank you. So I'm afraid we're only halfway through the morning, so there's another two substantive papers to come. And the first of those is in relation to precision breeding. And I've now got my notes all in a terrible muddle. Anyway, here we go. We're going to move on to discussing precision breeding. Really pleased to welcome to the table James Cooper, who's leading this work. And this paper is really to update on the recent public consultation and for us to hear about the next steps in relation to precision breeding. This consultation was about the FSA's regulatory framework. This will become another of the regimens that we look at under our regulated products service. So it's the regulatory framework is the part of the Act for which the FSA has specific responsibilities. The board will have seen from the responses to the consultation that a number of people took the opportunity to reiterate some of the comments that had previously been made about the overarching Act. And indeed, we've had a number of questions to the board today which relate to areas which are out with the FSA's responsibilities. And I think, given that this is a sort of ongoing theme of questions to the board, I thought it might be helpful for me to start with some general remarks. I think that if I look back over the last year or more when we've been discussing this issue, it will be clear to those who followed the debate that there are a range of views amongst board members in relation to precision breeding. And we've discussed this topic very extensively, and indeed I've been quite proud of the robust challenge and conversation that we've had around the board table. We've also taken the opportunity outside of board meetings to hear from stakeholders through both formal and informal consultation, and at events, whether they've been planned consultation events or whether they've been ad hoc meetings at other networking occasions. And so I see this formal public consultation really as the last stage in that process. We need to remember that Parliament has debated this bill And there was a very robust discussion and a degree of challenge. And the Precision Breeding Act reflects the outcomes of that discussion. Parliament has decided that it wishes to introduce precision bred organisms into the food system. And the FSA board has independently reached a collective view that precision bred organisms may bring some significant consumer benefits. That said, we acknowledge that this is a new technology. We've seen no evidence that it's inherently more risky than traditional breeding, but I totally recognise the concerns about the absence of evidence. And there will be an absence of evidence until we introduce these products. We don't consider that that should be a block to future development, but what it does do is to absolutely reinforce the importance of having a robust, independent regulatory framework that enables us to assess their safety. And that's really what I want us to focus on today. That is the FSA's responsibility, to ensure that any precision-bred organisms which reach the market have been assessed to the best of our ability, using the best evidence that we have available, that they are safe. So I want to really focus our conversation today on that regulatory framework. And I do also want to hear more about the plans we have to establish this service within the FSA, because I'm very conscious that we need to be absolutely ready to receive applications to the timelines that DEFRA set out. And given the pressures that we have just been discussing in relation to our regulated products service more generally, I do want to be confident that having got to this place in relation to precision-bred organisms, that we are going to be able to assess those and to approve them in due course. So with that sort of background, I'm going to turn to James Cooper, who, as I said, is our Deputy Director of Food Policy, and just ask James to very briefly introduce the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So the paper summarises the responses we received to our consultation, which ran from the 8th of November 2023 to the 8th of January. With Susan's framing in mind, I'm going to focus my comments on the next steps in development of the regulatory framework. I'd just like to say thanks to the team for both the delivery of the consultation and the in-depth analysis of the responses. We had 412 responses, which is small as government consultations go, but quite substantial as far as FSA ones go. So a big thank you to them for all the hard work in pulling that together. We received a range of comments about how we should implement the proposed regulatory regime, but we didn't receive any new compelling evidence to support an alternative regulatory regime from that was agreed by the board in September 2023. So from a legislative perspective, we're proceeding with the approach that was agreed at the September board, and that legislative process is ongoing with DEFRA. In terms of how we might deliver the proposed regime, key points we've taken from the consultation and the responses include the importance of clarity on the triage criteria and in the requirements for Tier 2. The board's suggestion of a pre-authorisation audit process for some Tier 1 notifications was supported, with more work again required on the detail of that to ensure proportionality and sufficient scrutiny. And there was support for an enforcement regime that is sufficiently robust in the absence of labelling. So what that means in terms of next steps, as I noted, we're moving forward through the legislative process with DEFRA. We're developing the technical guidance, which will provide a lot of the detail on the requirements of the regime that's been asked for. We expect that to go to the ACNFP at the start of May, with user testing happening thereafter. The delivery of the service is being brought into the wider regulated product service. We'll be developing administrative guidance to support that and working with the wider regulatory products teams to make sure that we can get the service up and running. Again, the guidance for that will be user tested, and we're working on an assumption that we need to be ready to receive applications early next year. And then finally, we'll also be developing enforcement guidance, both for the enforcement bodies in England, where precision-bred organisms are being authorised, but also taking into account the considerations of the Internal Markets Act and the implications for the devolved governments. With that, I would welcome board reflections and comments.
Thank you very much, James. I am encouraged by the breadth of responses to the consultation, and I have looked at them all, and I agree with you that I don't think we've heard anything new that hasn't come up in previous discussions with stakeholders, and that rather encourages me in a way that our prior consultation and engagement had been fruitful. I've already mentioned that there were some wider comments in relation to the Precision Breeding Act itself, but the other things that are very clearly very prominent, and indeed in the questions that we've had to the board today, is that there continue to be very strong feelings on the subject of labelling. And I know it's frustrating for many people who have made these comments to us in the FSA, but I have to just repeat that it is DEFRA who have responsibility for non-safety labelling and not the FSA. There are also concerns about traceability, especially from the organic sector, who are reasonably anxious about their ability to ensure the integrity in their supply chains and therefore to ensure consumer choice. But in fact, traceability concerns go beyond the organic sector. This issue came up at a previous meeting, and I'm quite keen to hear from Julie Pearce, to tell us a little bit more about traceability. So I'm going to suggest that we start with that point. I'll turn first to Julie just to tell us where we're up to on that. And then I'll come to board members for your wider reflections on the consultation, and importantly and in particular, any factors which have arisen which you think mean that we should consider making any changes in the framework. And then I want to move on to discuss the implementation plans that James has helpfully started to set out. So Julie, traceability.
Thank you very much, Chair. So yes, traceability is a broader topic that goes much wider than precision breeding across the whole of the food system for various purposes. And I think we recognise the importance of traceability, but also many innovations in traceability that have been happening over the last few years. So I think for PB generally, there's an opportunity to build on and exploit the capabilities that there are already in the system, whether that be what I might call sort of documentary traceability enabled by modern types of technology, or whether innovation at the more analytical end of the system, trying to better understand and get verification of the actual food stuff that we're looking at. So I think that's an area to explore further. But one where we would be looking to, as I said, exploit what is already going on within the industry rather than trying to create something completely brand new, separate. So these are some initial thoughts. Further to go there.
Thank you. Fiona, I know this is something that you have been concerned about. Do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Yes, I wanted to pick up on the traceability piece. We're being told that it's something that the FSA can't be responsible for. But I feel that, and that has to come from DEFRA, and there's a specific ask potentially to look at how seed can be labelled in the same way that it's being recommended in the EU, but also how otherwise supply chains can actually ensure that traceability is possible. And this is my question. We can't enforce, or we can't require our regulatory partners to enforce whether a product is GM-free if a business or a consumer group who are buying a particular product want to have a PB-free product. We can't enable or support trade across the internal markets if it can't be traceable. And also there's the additional piece, which is to do with the legal requirements for organic to exclude PB. And at the moment, there's no requirement in the framework to actually assist that process or actually make it possible. And I feel that we are kicking the ball back over the fence to DEFRA and saying it's your problem, whereas we should be working in the way that only we can across the government process to actually make sure that this is possible and that our regimes are enforceable. So that was the point I really wanted to make. But there's an additional point then coming on to the guidance that there can be an explicit requirement to ensure that traceability is possible, and perhaps to reference some of the methodologies that you're identifying in your research, Julie, so that we can signpost as much as possible for those systems that want to exclude it and to enable the cross-border trade as well. Thank you.
Thank you. James or Rebecca, did you, well, actually, Margaret, was yours about traceability, or was it a different point? If it's about traceability, I suggest you come in now. If not, I'm going to go back to Rebecca or James to respond on that.
It's support for what Fiona's saying, but it also brings in the labelling side of things. The general point is very similar, so I'd like to make it at some point.
Okay, Rebecca or James, who wants to respond on the traceability question?
I can see James was going to come in, but I just wanted to say I think we're wrapping up a lot of separate issues under this general heading of traceability here. So, I mean, the FSA, I can assure you, is very concerned about supply chain integrity and the ability of sort of the different businesses involved in the production of food to know where their ingredients have come from and where they're going. And that principle is something that we've discussed previously in relation to precision bred products. And our advice is that we think those protections are robust. They can be enforced. We use them all the time, for example, when we're doing incident investigations, and those will apply to precision bred products as well. That's one aspect of it. There are some technical aspects around testing and work ongoing. As Julie said, there's work ongoing to look how we can improve that information going up and down the supply chain. We've investigated the issue of testing and confirmed that there isn't currently a scientific test that you can pick something off a shelf and say that it's been precision bred, as indeed applies to many other aspects of the food that's on our shelves. That's not different for precision bred products. And then this brings us on obviously to the wider aspects of consumer information, labelling, and some very specific questions about organic standards. Whereas, as the chair has noted, many of these are general policy responsibilities for DEFRA. We've engaged with them and discussed with them as we continue to do. But we are working within the regulations as they are now, and we are very confident that we'll have the ability for manufacturers and producers to be able to select the products that they want to use in the way that they do now. So I think important to remember that there are lots of things wrapped up in this issue of traceability.
James, did you want to add anything more to that?
Yeah, I'd just say, Rebecca's absolutely right. We're confounding the issue of traceability and detection. So we can absolutely trace, because food law requires each step in the chain to be able to know exactly where their supplies have come from and where their supplies are going to. So if as a business you want to trace whether your product has PB in it, you can ask the question commercially up the line, and if somebody doesn't want to tell you, then don't do business with them. So that exists in food law. That knowledge has to be there because food law requires it to be there. How the consumer understands whether these things are in there, that again, we do not in any way prevent a commercial decision to label things as either PB free or containing PB if a business wishes to do that in order to gain access to a particular consumer market. And again, they have the ability to do that because the traceability up the chain does exist. There is the argument that whether labelling would or wouldn't facilitate that, but as Susan has said, that's outside of our purview. But from a food safety perspective, the traceability up the chain is there.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Margaret first because that's sort of slipped into labelling, and why don't, Margaret, you make your wider comments, and then I'm going to turn to David.
Yeah, absolutely. I acknowledge that some of the people who really care about these things are in the audience here today. They've travelled to Leeds because it matters to them. So the question really is, can we do more to ensure that concerns over labelling and traceability, but let's talk about labelling now, get to the right people? Can we do more? Because these concerns are being exposed by our own FSA consultations time and time again, and yet the majority of people who are opposed may feel that their views are actually not going unheard because we're mentioning them, but are making no difference. And that's a reputational and a trust issue for us. So we can't put them aside. And it's really good, Susan, that you raised them right at the top here. I think that shows that we're in a bit of a dilemma here. Parliament's decided it's going to happen. It will go ahead. But I certainly think, for example, I support the idea that the public must have information on enough information to be able to choose whether or not they use precision-bred stuff, and that's the case for labelling. So back to that key question, what more can we do to ensure that the people who do have these big concerns that we don't necessarily have the remit to do anything about, what more can we do to ensure that we make sure their views are getting across and have weight?
Thank you, Margaret. I'm going to scoop up other comments from the board and then we'll come back to officials at the end. David.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Having read the paper in detail a few times, one sentence stood out for me. It's in paragraph 4.1, and it says, following consultation, quote, our analysis has not identified any reason to revisit the fundamental decisions made by the board in September 2013, unquote. And I agree entirely with that. And you were right to point out, Chair, about if 77% of respondents don't like the Act of Parliament, then I'm sorry, that's just too bad. It was agreed by both Houses of Parliament with a majority, and that is called democracy. And Margaret, I do respect the point you're making about labelling, but I'm not sure what more the board can do. We're aware of the point. We've discussed it lots of times. The Chair's discussed it today, but it's a definite, it's a government matter, not us. The other few points I want to make, I'm disappointed that some people are still attacking our top scientists in our advisory committee. They're packed full of integrity. They're not in league with the industry, and I defend their integrity to the utmost. Penultimate point, Annex A, the timeline for the SI is tight, but I think if I recall correctly, James, in the Act, there's you only need the affirmative procedure if one is changing the substance of the primary act, and everything else I think is negative. If it's a negative SI, then it should be possible to lay it by the recess, and I think you can lay it during the recess as well, and it goes through without parliamentary debate. And finally, I think the most important point is Annex B. We must now push on and create that technical guidance. I'm not sure if the board will have a chance to see it. I'm not sure we'd all understand it even if we did see it. But creating that technical guidance is now the top priority, in my opinion. So we've debated this for a long time. It's been approved by Parliament time and time again. Let's crack on and get the guidance ready.
Thank you, David. So I think just to summarise the consultation and the regulatory framework part, and then I do just want to have a few minutes discussion on the implementation and the delivery part. I really do recognise the underlying anxieties that we've heard from some NGOs and some individual consumers, which, in some cases are as fundamental as worrying about the inherent safety of precision-bred organisms. Nothing is ever certain, and this is a new technology, but Parliament has debated this and agreed that it should be allowed, and we now have to ensure that our regulation is proportionate to that risk. I think one of the things that I like about the regulatory system that has been proposed is that it balances that aspiration to be as light touch as it can be, where that is justified, whilst also absolutely having in place what I kind of think of as the safety valve in the two-tier system, so that if there is reason to think that this product needs a bespoke risk assessment, then it will be a tier 2 product and it will have the full weight of the FSA risk assessment tailored to the particular risk that we think that this presents. And we've been very careful to set out the distinction between Tier 1 and Tier 2 in guidance and not in law. And that means that we will be able to be agile and to flex this system as we learn, as we go along, about more about the nature of these products and the types of challenges that they present. So I think that for me at least gives me a little bit more reassurance that our regulation can be as light or as heavy as it needs to be proportionate to the risk. And I know the Business Committee will want to scrutinise that quite carefully as we go forward, as we monitor the performance of this service over time. I think David also referred to another point which I think we do need to acknowledge as a board, and that is the concerns that have been expressed in the questions to the board about potential conflicts of interest in our scientific committees. The FSA relies heavily on the expertise of our scientists throughout all of our work. This is not just about precision breeding. And I'm very aware that this topic has also arisen, indeed in Parliament, in relation to the House of Lords inquiry on ultra-processed food. There is, I think, a need for us to assure ourselves as a board that we have got this processes right in terms of managing conflicts of interest, or indeed to recognise if we haven't, and to identify if there are areas that this needs to be strengthened. As I say, this is not specific to precision breeding, so I don't want to get diverted on it today. We have looked at this and we feel confident that ACNFP are giving us the best advice that we can get at the moment. But I think that, sorry to spring this on you, Robin, but I think I'm going to suggest that we ask you to bring a paper to a future board meeting. And I don't know if that will be June or September. We need to look at the agendas. But I think to just remind the board what we already do in relation to overseeing and managing conflicts or potential conflicts, I guess the declaration of interests that are made by our scientific committee members, and perhaps to think about whether there are any areas where we might want to consider going further or strengthening the things we have in place. So for the purposes of this agenda item, I do want to acknowledge that's a concern. I want to reiterate that we have looked at it. Both Emily as the Chief Executive and me as Chair of the Board have reviewed all of the declarations from the ACNFP members, and we're content that that no further action is needed. But I think we should take this on as a wider issue, just so that the board is assured that we are setting the best possible standards for how this is managed. I've not heard anything from anybody which suggests we fundamentally need to change the consultation, or indeed change any, the regulatory framework, or indeed any aspects of that. So I'm going to take that as read and ask officials really to press on and put this into place. And that leads me to just asking board members for any comments they wish to make on the delivery and the sort of implementation plan, which James outlined in his opening comments. Tim.
Thank you. Agree with everything that's just been said. I think there's possibility and scope linked to our previous conversation around market authorization and regulated products, that whatever we do in this space and any safeguards we put in place are on a converging path for the generality of the processes we put around market authorization.
Absolutely, Tim. I sort of take that as read, but on the other hand, it's also extremely helpful just to say it explicitly. This needs to just become another of our regulated products services. On implementation, again, I think, James, it would be really helpful if you could provide the board, probably just out with of the board meeting, given the pace this is moving at, with some further details of how this is going to be embedded within the FSA. More detail on the timelines, also the resource implications. I know that's slightly difficult to judge because it's hard for us to know just how many applications will come forward and to what timeline. But nonetheless, I would quite like to be assured of the the detail of the nature of the planning that's gone into setting up this service, and I say that again against the backdrop of our scrutiny of the regulated products service more generally. If there's nothing else from board members, I'm just going to go back to James or indeed Rebecca if there's any final comments that you want to make, or indeed any questions you want to ask the board to give you the necessary steers to be able to press on with this to the sort of timeline that we've set out. James.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for the board's agreement to moving on as proposed. Just to quickly come back on Lord Blencathra's point, unfortunately, all our legislation is affirmative resolution. We are hoping to be able to get it through ahead of a general election, but there is the risk, obviously, that we might not be able to do that because it will require debates in order to go through. And just to sort of reflect back on Susan's point, we're absolutely keeping an eye on how the work we're doing with PB is fitting into the wider reform programme, making sure that that is as convergent as possible. Thank you.
Very good. So just to wrap up this item, I think that we have indeed noted the approach to the secondary legislation and the timeline. We've had another discussion, and I think some important points raised about traceability and labelling in particular, to just keep looking again at whether there is more we can do in relation to the labelling issue. But overall, we've agreed the FSA's proposed approach to the regulatory framework, and also agreed in principle to the next steps for implementation, but asked for further detail to be provided to the board to just assure us as to what is planned and indeed what we can expect. And this again will be something that will be picked up by the business committee in scrutinising the day-to-day performance of the agency. Very good. Thank you, James. Thank you to the team. This has been another intensive bit of work. I have absolutely no doubt that the FSA is working very, very hard at the moment. There is a lot on. So thank you for all of that. I also know that you have been engaging with officials in the European Union who are also thinking about their approach to precision-bred organisms, and I really welcome that constructive engagement that's going on there. As we heard from NIFAC and WFAC, one of the concerns of the devolved nations is the issue of divergence, and so I very much hope that over time we will see some alignment on this between ourselves and Europe. Thank you. So, colleagues, one more paper and then we will break for coffee. And this is actually a really important paper, and I'm very, very pleased that it's come to the board today because it's about foodborne disease. And foodborne disease is at the absolute heart of what the FSA is all about, and indeed why we were set up. It's actually been some time since we've had an item on foodborne disease at the board. In fact, I haven't seen one as chair, and hence was very, very keen that we should really have a bit of an update on what's happening. Just to reassure stakeholders and the public, we do absolutely keep a close eye on changes in the prevalence of foodborne disease at every single business committee meeting. And of course, we also follow the work that goes on in relation to individual incidents. But I thought it would be helpful for the whole board to have a reminder of the wider policy work that's going on across the FSA, which is about trying to mitigate the risks of foodborne disease. So this paper is, for the most part, a sort of status update. This is what we're doing, but it does include some information about next steps, including updating our threshold levels. And I see this as an opportunity for the board to provide a steer to the executive on any additional work that we think is necessary in this area. So I was about to welcome the officials to the table, but James is still with us. So when James isn't busy with precision breeding, he's been overseeing foodborne disease with his colleague Natasha, who is not able to be with us in person today. But James is also joined by Anthony Wilson, who leads the team for risk assessment in this area. So I'm going to hand over once again, I think probably to James, to just introduce this paper.
Thank you, Susan. And yes, this was supposed to be presented by my job share partner, Natasha Smith, who unfortunately can't be with us for family reasons. So I'd like to first of all say thank you to the team for pulling this together. It's a big piece of work to summarise everything that we're doing across the FSA on foodborne disease, because it is an awful lot of work that is embedded throughout what the FSA does. So this paper gives an overview of the foodborne disease work in the UK and how it's fundamental to the FSA and its activities. Pathogens are a risk throughout the food system, and so our action has to follow that and be across the food system. And all players in that food system, both us as a regulator, local authorities, businesses, have a role to play in that. From an FSA perspective, as set out in the paper, there are 3 parts to our approach. Horizon scanning, which does exactly what it says on the tin, looking out there, finding out what the threats, what are the opportunities, be they from new technologies or new pathogens or new foods, and what we need to do about them. Continuous improvements, that's about looking at the controls we have in place, and there we've got our sort of 3 basic lines of defence. We've got what FBOs do, making sure they do the right thing in terms of how we provide safer food, better business guidance, the HACCP guidance, all those kind of things. And the inspections that are directly carried out by the FSA and our operational teams and local authority officers in terms of sort of the at the coalface work, and then our wider role in making sure the overall system works effectively and that we're giving consumers the right information to enable them to act effectively. And then the third part of what we do is about the thresholds, and this is about monitoring the sort of 4 major pathogens that are out there that are either responsible for very high numbers of cases or more likely to cause severe symptoms. And this is a way of triggering action if these levels fall outside the usual statistical variation. And we need to make sure that we're taking action at the right time, which is why we have those thresholds in place. They're currently in the process of being reviewed and updated, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later. So just talking very quickly about the sort of 4 major pathogens that we look at, just to illustrate how those sort of 3 limbs work in practice. So Campylobacter is the leading cause of foodborne disease in the UK, focused on chickens as the cause the majority of cases. And so in response to that, we put in place the Campylobacter reduction strategy in partnership with industry, and that's an example of where we've seen a big need and we've put in place a large piece of work in partnership with industry to try and tackle an issue. Salmonella, the number of cases of outbreaks in consumption of eggs and egg products hasn't changed significantly since 2016 when the last risk assessment was done. Our advice has remained unchanged as a result of that, even through avian influenza, and we have looked at whether we needed to change that as part of AI, but it hasn't needed to change. And so this is an example of somewhere where we're just monitoring against our thresholds, looking at those long-term trends, seeing if something is changing and being ready to act if that happens. E. coli 0157, there we've issued consumer advice to highlight the risk of illness from frozen, partially cooked poultry products. That was in reaction to an incident in 2022. So there it's about ensuring that when we see something happening, we understand the problem, look at it, and adjust our guidance appropriately to manage that risk and ensure that it can't happen again. And then finally, Listeria. It's rare in healthy adults and children, causes very few symptoms, but can cause severe illness in vulnerable groups. It's widespread in the environment, but most of the problems we see are from contamination in ready-to-eat foods. So again, there's an example there where we had an incident involving smoked fish, and so we've updated our guidance there to ensure that consumers have the right advice and those who are vulnerable know what they need to do, and actually that they're thinking about the right product. So the issue is with cold smoked fish that isn't subject to any heat treatment, whereas hot smoked fish is less of a risk. So we need to make sure we're very differential on our guidance, and that's why we're very focused on our approach. So, as set out in the paper, and as I sort of briefly mentioned, advances in the science and the sampling approaches mean that the thresholds that we're looking at are potentially need reviewing, because there's a bit of a case if you look more, find more. So there's some work going on with UKHSA to help us achieve that, and we'll be hopefully bringing a paper back to the board on resetting those thresholds in due course when we have the data that we need to finish that work. And on that, I think I'll hand over for thoughts and reflections.
Thank you very much, James. That was very helpful indeed. This is such a core part of the work of the FSA, and it does require constant vigilance. There's, I hear what you're saying about improved detection methods, but actually, if it is out there, I do want to know about it. And by tracking it down and knowing where the risky points are, we'll be able to better protect the small number of people who are going to really have very terrible effects from foodborne disease. I'm conscious that there has been some media reporting on this, which was quite worrying recently, and indeed that's referred to in some of the questions to the board. And I wonder if I could just ask you perhaps just to comment on that, and particularly this suggestion that there has been a significant rise in cases of salmonella in people who've been hospitalised. Do you want to just... James, are you the right person just to pick that up?
I'll give a 30-second intro while Anthony gets ready to go. So, I mean, again, as I said, this is actually another case of, in a summary, look more, find more. So it's about how the detection methods and the number of samples that are actually picked up in hospitals are confirmed as cases, and therefore we're finding more because more are being confirmed, not because there's necessarily more out there. But I think I'll hand over to Anthony to give the more detailed explanation.
Thanks. Thanks, James. Yes, I would reiterate the same point. We've seen a rollout of increased use of PCR testing of samples from hospitals, and we're actually seeing a slight decrease in the total number of cases of people hospitalised with gastrointestinal symptoms. But the proportion of those in which we're able to attribute it to a specific pathogen is going up. So that's mostly what's happening, and that's what the figures show in terms of hospitalisation.
Thank you. I see that Robin had his hand up as well. Robin, was it on this point you want? Well, why don't you comment? This is not only your partly under your responsibility as CSA, but of course I know you've got a sort of personal academic interest in this too.
Thanks, Susan. Yes, wearing both hats. I'll just to add to Anthony's point. So I think there are multiple things going on here. Overall, hospitalisations for gastrointestinal disease are actually lower now than they were a couple of years ago. As a proportion, these diagnosed ones are higher, largely because of better testing. However, there is also some suggestion of recent data that once you're diagnosed with Campylobacter or Salmonella, your chance of progressing to hospital is higher than it was a few years ago. And we need more data to understand what's going on there. There are multiple possibilities. One possibility is the population is changing, we're getting older, in many cases less healthy, and so we may be more at risk once you get infected. There are obviously very well publicised challenges around things like GP access, which might mean that people are presenting later with more extensive symptoms, or there may be shifts in the underlying sort of biology, if you like, either of ourselves or of those pathogens that are out there, and we just don't know the answer for that yet. I think the improved diagnostic that Anthony's referred to will be enormously useful. It is in everyone's interest, not least the patient, to know what you've got when you go in. So we need to be cautious to understand that an increase in a particular pathogen is not necessarily indicative of a change overall in disease, and may in fact be a good thing clinically, notwithstanding the fact that we clearly need to understand where it's come from and do our best to minimise that. Thanks.
Thank you. That's extraordinarily helpful and somewhat reassuring. Though I do think, I'm very pleased to hear that work's going on. I assume closely with UKHSA to really get to the bottom of these figures. Anthony, I can see you're waiting to come in.
Thank you, Susan. We had a long discussion of this paper at NIFAC, and it's a very good paper. People were very pleased with it. We did note the impact of the pandemic, the dips, and we recognised that taking it forward. We had an awful lot of questions, which we thankfully had answered by James and Anthony, so I'll not repeat them today. But there was one area that the committee were keen that I would bring forward, particularly, was given the prevalence of listeria in pre-packed sandwiches, would it be worth having labels on these to note some of the risks for those in the at-risk groups? We accept that there is guidance, but we also recognise that not everybody has access to the guidance, and extra labelling could be helpful for people generally. One of our colleagues who works in the pre-packed ready-made food industry indicated that some organisations already do this, but it's very ad hoc. It's not particularly well controlled, and would it be better to have a more formal approach to it? So that was the question particularly they wanted me to put to you today.
Thank you. Are there questions from anyone else on the board, or whilst you're thinking, James or Anthony, do you want to just respond to that? And
yeah, so the question of sort of health warning labels on products for foodborne disease is something that we have considered a number of times. But the challenge is that the risks vary so much from food to food. I mean, taking the smoked fish example, a cold smoked fish sandwich would be risky, but a hot smoked fish sandwich wouldn't. And so if you start going down the road of having sort of more generic advice for vulnerable consumers on individual packages, it's much harder for the consumers to actually work out what they need to do. Whereas so long as what's in the sandwich is clearly labelled, then as an individual consumer, you can understand what your risk factors are, what foods you need to avoid, and you can then take the appropriate action and choose to have the hot smoked fish sandwich rather than the cold smoked fish sandwich. And what we don't want to do is inadvertently prevent people from having choice as to what they eat by having more blanket labelling that could prevent them from sort of having foods that are perfectly safe for them. So that more bespoke guidance is more helpful. Where there are clear health risks across the board for things like raw drinking milk, where the nature of it being untreated makes it inherently risky, then we do encourage health warnings on that. But where it's so individual dependent, it's much more effective to have the bespoke advice, we think.
Except that, James, I think the concern was that not everybody knows that they have a risk to listeria, and putting it labelling on certain products like the cold smoked fish would actually highlight it to people that there is an issue there, more than just a general warning, be careful. But except it's hard to put everything on every label for everybody. So I do get that. It's just risk-based, I suppose, which is usually what we do anyway.
Yeah, and there's nothing to stop manufacturers choosing to do that to help their consumers. And of course, actually what we're trying to do ultimately is remove the risk by dealing with things up the chain anyway. So it is that balance of risk and how we best manage it.
James, you're right. There's nothing to stop manufacturers doing that, but some progressive ones might. But our job is to ensure that we pull up the minimum and that we get this done in the best way possible. I do think it may be worth us, as we think more about our work on foodborne disease, is thinking whether we should be doing more. I was struck again by the incident in relation to unpasteurized cheese recently. And although, cheeses do say whether they are pasteurized or unpasteurized, I'm not absolutely sure that all consumers make that link that unpasteurized cheese may carry greater risks. So I don't want to get into that in detail today, but could I ask the executive just to do a little bit more thinking about whether our approach to warning people about the risks is proportionate? We've at other times said you can't write everything on the label, and I totally accept that. So I think it is about proportionality. I've got Mark, and then Margaret, and then David.
Thanks, Susan. Just a reflection from me, if I may. This is an excellent paper, thank you, and it's really informative. My concern is that it only tells part of the story. This paper is entitled Foodborne Disease, but it's about what I might call food poisoning type disease, and it doesn't cover the kind of foodborne disease that we do an immense amount of work on, and our delivery partners, particularly in local authorities, do an immense amount of work on in terms of chemical contamination, toxins, and so on, all of which have the potential to lead to disease. So no criticism of this paper. I think it's excellent, but I think it only tells half the story, and we are doing an immense amount of work to ensure that food is safe in other areas other than just this.
Thank you. Margaret?
My point adds to that, actually. It's the idea that we make sure we keep the balance. Yes, we need to tell consumers if they're vulnerable that if there is poison in the food and they are vulnerable for health or age reasons, then it may affect them more. But ultimately, we should be making sure that the retailers and the manufacturers are not putting onto the market food that is not that safe. And then secondly, just when it gets to thresholds, obviously this is going to be so clearly science and evidence backed, because we can't be seen to be moving thresholds just because numbers are moving. We need to make sure that we're doing it for really good reason. I'm not a great threshold fan, as you know.
And David?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I wasn't going to comment on this until James mentioned raw milk, and then you got in before me. I am concerned that our warnings on cheese made from raw milk in England are not sufficient or adequate. And now is not the time to get into detail. But as you know, raw milk was banned in Scotland years ago because of cases of brucellosis and deaths there. I entirely respect the right of consumers in England to eat cheese made with raw milk. But not all consumers see the warning. For example, on the train company I have to use every week, they used to have a cheese board, a selection from the supplier who had the E. coli. Now, the cheeses weren't named on the menu. We didn't know who they were from, and we didn't know they were made from raw milk. And that could have been a source, could have been a cause of more outbreaks. So I'd like the executive, please, to look at, and it's not a matter for us, it's for DEFRA, but to look at the warnings we have on cheese made from raw milk in England, because I don't think they're adequate.
Yeah, safety labelling is for us, actually. But anyway, let's take this away and think about it. Rhian and then Tim.
Thank you, Susan. Just a point, when we looked at this paper at WFAC last week, it was really good to get an update, really welcomed the paper. Just a comment, we asked as a result of the WFAC meeting if at some point in the future we can have a bit of a deep dive on the Wales data, which we appreciate being a very small proportion of the total data, and we make an assumption for now that it very much mirrors the national trends that we're seeing. So it's not a cause for concern, but just a real interest to look at the Wales data in a future deep dive. But one of the reasons for that, there is a concern. So in Wales, food manufacturers, the accessibility and affordability of laboratory testing for food manufacturers in Wales has been brought up a few times in WFAC meetings. And I just want to put that into the discussion, not something for now, but when we think about again, going back to that landscape of companies that we are looking to support to do the right thing and produce safe food, that's just come up a few times. So the cost of the testing and the accessibility. So we lost a UCAS accredited testing lab in Wales recently due to a fire, and regionality matters. Food manufacturers will look for closer to home testing facilities for a lot of reasons, and so I just want to put that into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim?
Thank you. Yes, and I'm really pleased Rhian said what she said, particularly in advance of my point, because I think the economic benefits of both the interventions at a lab level and the investment that goes with it, justifying that, but also more broadly, the FSA's contribution, as far as we can quantitate it, is something that we might be better presenting if we can, if the evidence is there. I know it's quite difficult because avoidable disease is always difficult to put a value to, but I think that where we are seeing differences and we can relate that to both what's happening on a regional basis or indeed more broadly, then we should certainly explore doing that, because it is a good news story for the most part, and I think that's something worth representing.
Thank you. And I can see that both Robin and Rebecca are going to come in. So I think what I'll do is, if there are no more comments from board members, I'll ask Robin for some, the point he was going to make, and then I guess any wider reflections on what you think, with your very much in your CSA mode, what do you think you would be recommending the board should be looking for in relation to our foodborne disease work? And then I'll come to Rebecca to make some final comments.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, a couple of points that came up in the discussion. So firstly, I was going to just pick up on the point about unpasteurised cheese, and just to set out for the record that not all unpasteurised cheese is inherently the same. So for example, much Parmesan is unpasteurised because it's hard, because it's salty, it's actually very low risk. Whereas some rind washed soft cheeses that are unpasteurised are much more risky. So I think just to set on the record for anyone listening to this that not all unpasteurised cheese are the same. On your point, Rhian, about Wales, one of the interesting and slightly puzzling pieces of data currently is that we have not seen the same increase in hospitalisation data for Wales as that we have for England. The big caveat there is that there is a data lag, so we don't have the same data flow from Wales. So that may suddenly correct itself. If it doesn't, that is very interesting. Similarly, data from Northern Ireland and Scotland will come out in the coming months. And I think for me, with my science hat on, that is a really critical piece of data. If all four nations are the same, then something inherently broad is going on. If there's a difference, we need to look into that and find out what's going on. And that, I think, to your point, Susan, is one of the things I would encourage the board and the executive to keep an eye on. And on the testing costs, your point about the cost of testing, in many ways, the changing testing landscape is a real benefit for public health. The more testing that goes on, things like lateral flow devices, the rollout of PCR is great. A slight challenge is that the data landscape is changing. A lot more testing is now going very local. So, for example, a lot of businesses do their own testing. We don't necessarily see that data straight away. So that is something I think we need to be more agile about getting the data feeds from going forwards. And then the last point from me, I just wanted to put on the record that the third intestinal infectious disease study that we fund is now underway. It's started just a few months ago. Like all clinical studies, that will take some time to report, but it is designed to report a very large data set on foodborne disease and potential attribution to that. And in particular, I think one of the things that I'm hoping that will answer is the very large amount of foodborne disease which is currently unattributed. So we monitor the 4 major pathogens. We know there are plenty of others out there. We don't have good data on that. When that reports, I think that is the moment for the FSA and the board to consider how we may change both our science and our policy based on those. But acting before we've got that data is a bit too preemptive because we don't actually know what it's going to say yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. That was really helpful. I was particularly struck by your comment about data into the FSA, and I think we should make sure we pick up on that in our wider conversations with businesses about data and about how we get information from their other assurance mechanisms. I know lots of them are doing sort of, swab testing themselves for some of these bacteria. So, that would be a useful point to pick up on. Rebecca, I don't know if you wanted to make a separate point or whether you're going to respond to the comments that we've been made, but why don't you say your piece first and then I'll wrap up.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I was just going to come back on this issue of consumer information, and I really welcome the invitation from the board to look again at this. And as James says, we consider this very carefully, and it's something that we always come back to, particularly in response to an outbreak of foodborne disease. I'm glad Robin noted the complexities around this. It's not as simple as simply putting a label on particular categories of product, and that's why. One of our main efforts is to work really closely with the NHS and healthcare providers and people who are in contact with individuals who may have a specific susceptibility to make sure that individual tailored advice can be given to them. And we are constantly working with the NHS, with DHSE, with UXA and other colleagues to make sure that advice always reflects the very latest evidence. I also just wanted to make a note that in the case of something like, say, a pre-packed sandwich, generally this is a very safe food, the type that you might buy in a supermarket. They're produced under very high hygiene conditions. There are very strict regulations about all of that. So the risk is sometimes introduced after the product leaves the retail facility, and it comes down then to consumer behaviour, which again is something that we need to keep our focus on, how we're providing people in general with good information about how to store food, how to use it. And again, in a hospital or care setting, making sure that those organisations also understand their responsibilities when it may be friends or relatives, or maybe individuals are bringing food into that environment, and the importance of keeping it safe. And that labelling can play a part in that, but there are wider issues that we need to consider as well. So we'll take all that away and come back to you with some further advice.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. I think what this very brief, sort of rather sort of planned discussion has highlighted is that this is complex. I think we need to, in the FSA, need to stay focused on what we can do within the food system, and what should be done by food businesses, what should be done by organisations like the NHS. I always become a little bit anxious where we're putting too much responsibility on individuals within that system to do something differently. So expecting that health professionals are going to talk to every vulnerable consumer individually with a detailed list of foods that may be risky, I think is unrealistic. So I think we need to ensure that the system is set up to protect people as best we can. But let's return to this later. So we've also heard some comments, a request for some data in relation to incidents in the devolved countries. I think that's sensible and hopefully relatively easy to provide. We haven't really talked more about Mark's initial comment that this is only half the picture and we're not looking at contaminants and toxins, but I think that's a topic for another day, but let's not lose sight of it. And then I think the whole issue of testing relates to lab capacity, which we've touched on previously. And as I mentioned a moment or two ago, I do think we need to consider how the FSA gets best access to the data that is available that businesses when businesses are testing themselves. So I think there are a number of sort of disparate bits of follow-up from this, and I really look forward to us having future discussions. I think the time for this topic to come back to the board will be when you have put together the evidence package and the advice in relation to thresholds, so that we can have a discussion on that. And some of the other topics I suggest we pick up in briefings to the board over the coming months, and then we can decide if they warrant coming to a full board meeting in due course. So in wrapping up this item, I think it has been a really helpful update. It's been very good to see the sort of current profile of foodborne disease. We're very keen to see the next steps and look forward to that paper on thresholds. And the business committee will continue to keep an eye on the performance of our the number of incidents, prevalence, and also our response to incidents as we go along. Any other specific actions that board members want us to pick up following this item? In which case, I'm going to call it a day, not only for this item, but also to conclude the first half of this meeting. Thank you so much. We've had, some really substantive discussions there, and I appreciate people's engagement with this. Lots of work for the executive to do. We're now going to break. We're going to actually have a 30-minute break, recognising this has been quite a long session, and there's another long one to follow. When we return, Tim Riley will be in the chair. As I said earlier, I need to offer my very sincere apologies that I shall have to miss the second half of the meeting. I will, of course, catch up with the web recording online later, and look forward to catching up with you all in due course over the coming months, and again at our June board meeting, which will be held in North Wales in Llandudno. So we'll break there. Thank you, and I hope the rest of the meeting goes well.
Can I welcome everybody back after the break? For those people that have just joined us, I'm Tim Riley, Deputy Chair, and as Susan Jebb explained at the beginning of the meeting, due to a personal matter, she's unable to be with us for this second part of the meeting. So as a consequence, I'll be taking over chairing in her absence. So we're going back to the agenda, and the next item is the Chief Executive's report to the board. So I will invite Emily to summarise her report. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everybody. So you have my written report in front of you. I'll just pick out a couple of issues. I mentioned that the restoration of the Northern Ireland Executive has implications for Assembly oversight of regulatory changes in Northern Ireland. So we're just making sure we align with the requirements there of their regulatory scrutiny processes. We've had a reasonably busy time giving some evidence to the Westminster Parliament. So we responded to a House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committee inquiry, but also last week I was able to give evidence to the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee on vets. We do remain concerned about the immigration policy implications for our vet track and indeed possibly for our vets. That's on our minds at the moment. The FSA has done a campaign on showing that vegan food doesn't necessarily mean that it's free from because of risk of contamination. So we're pleased to have been doing that over the last few weeks. And then I just wanted to comment on the border target operating model and the implementation of it. We saw a relatively smooth implementation of the requirement for export health certificates in January. Where the next milestone is the introduction of risk-based physical checks at the end of April. There are still some things to be confirmed by government in relation to that implementation. So, for example, the exact check rates, some fees for consignments that get checked and so on. There is some live operational testing going on that the Cabinet Office is coordinating testing processes and systems. And as far as we can see, Port health authorities seem to be on track with their recruitment so that they will largely be in the right place by then. And we know that some importers are helping their suppliers to get ready. So we're reasonably confident that readiness will be in the right place, although there is still some work to do before then. I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Emily. Can I take any questions from around the table or through those that are on the Teams? Margaret.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Emily. I always love reading your report because it shows how much is going on. On the borders, is the necessary infrastructure in place for the checks coming in at the end of next month? And also, are you not concerned, even though it's not out of our remit, that you've just raised that some things aren't yet in place, and yet we're talking 4 to 5 weeks away? Secondly, really appreciate the strong message you put out to the was it EFRA on the need for change on the vets, because the situation is really very serious, and I felt that you've been making that case very strongly. And where are we on that now? Have you had a reaction? And then thirdly, I just wanted to, because you put it in your report here, the allergen issue. Some allergen sufferers wouldn't dare buy online unless they could read what the ingredients were, and the ones that were in bold. Were they contacted at all with regard to the particular survey that you refer to, and also the advice that people should look for may contain, did that also include the fact that we are now looking to say, to add to may contain, giving reasons why it may contain, for extra clarity?
Thank you, Margaret. Shall I just see if there are any other comments around the table, and then if there are, we can take them together? No? Okay, Emily. Emily, if we could just talk about the borders and the timescales for implementation, state of play on the vets and allergens, please.
I'm going to ask Rebecca to pick up the allergen question because I don't know the direct answer, but or we may need to come back to you, Margaret. I'll take them in reverse order. So on vets, has there been any reaction? We are still in a position where we don't have an exemption to the salary requirements that are being imposed in April, which I think puts us in a difficult position. So that I am concerned about at the moment. On borders, we do think the necessary infrastructure is in place. Angeli's nodding at me, so I'm hoping that's correct. There was a lot of infrastructure and people put in place in the run-up to the previous milestones, and we're just now at these final points of making sure that people have been trained on the guidance and making sure these final decisions get made about the quantity of checks. It's also going to be an incremental experience once the requirements come in, making sure that we swiftly and with DEFRA deal with any emerging issues and then implement the expectations in a sensible and proportionate way at the start.
Angeli.
Thanks, Tim. Just to supplement what Emily said, there's an outstanding question, Margaret, around the West Coast checks, which across government is being discussed, that involves the devolved administrations. So that's the infrastructure that's still under discussion. So just to flag on that. And just on the, are we ready for April? Are we concerned given the timelines? One of the key aspects that was committed to when Borders Target Operating Model first came in was the learning. What were the potential issues that were arising? How can we learn from that, ready for implementation in April? So some of this is expected in terms of timelines.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Angeli. Any other comments? Rebecca?
Yes, just going back to Margaret's question, was this about the survey of online purchasing? Yes, that was the work was conducted with people who had a food hypersensitivity, if that was your question.
Thank you, Rebecca. Any more comments from the board? If not, I'll thank Emily very much, and we can move on. The next item is the strategic risk management. I just remind the board and indeed executive that the board and executive held an annual risk workshop in January. This did provide the opportunity to think about the risks and opportunities that the FSA faces now and in the near future. And we're agreeing with what posed the greatest threat to us successfully achieving our objectives. So this paper summarises the outputs from the workshop. It puts on record, particularly in the context of this board, the principal risks we face and aims to monitor and further mitigate through our work to protect consumers in relation to food. I should highlight that for this item, what we're not looking for is a repeat of that detailed discussion or indeed the specific aspects of the risks and mitigations, because obviously full opportunity was held in January to do that. So having said that, could I invite Ruth Nolan to introduce the paper? Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
As you mentioned, this paper follows the detailed risk discussion we had at the board retreat in January. As many of you will be aware, this strategic risk management paper is an annual paper, which we aim to outline the FSA's approach to risk management and then formally put on record the principal risks that we face. And then for information in Annex B, we do lay out the different responsibilities of board, ARAC and the executive in terms of managing the risk throughout the rest of the year.
The paper starts by touching briefly on the operating context, and namely, and I think we all know this, is that the food system is extremely complicated and constantly evolving, but we can never truly fully eliminate all the risks, either because of the nature of the risks or the kind of level of resources we have, and that is a constant balance. What I think is different this year is the level of uncertainty that we are operating within. As Susan mentioned earlier, we have a general election due by January 25. 24-25 is the final year of our spending review settlement, and it is not yet clear when we will get certainty on our budgets from the 1st of April next year. So we are dealing with quite a lot of uncertainty. You will see that this year we've included more information on the actions that we're taking against each of the areas of risk, which I hope the board have found helpful. And with that, Tim, I was just going to pass back to you and just ask the board to formally note the paper, record the risks and the actions at this point in time, so it in effect becomes the benchmark for the year from which we move on.
Thank you, Ruth. That's very helpful. Can I take any questions or comments from around the table? So I've got Mark.
You got Mark here. I know you didn't want to get into the detailed wordsmithing, Tim, but I am just slightly concerned that risk number 5 here doesn't actually describe the risk that we're facing, because what the wording in that risk is about our inability to support local authorities. And I think the risk we're facing is that local authorities are not able to deliver the services that we need them to deliver. And I think the mitigations actually do describe what we're doing in relation to that risk, but the actual phrasing of the risk, I think, is more about an inability to support, whereas the real risk is that local authorities are unable to deliver.
Thank you. That can be noted. Any other comments? Ruth?
Thank you for that, Mark. So we do, this isn't the actual risk register, it's a kind of summary and paraphrasing, so we'll take away the comment and just check the wording on the actual risk register is absolutely tight and that it kind of covers things that are in our control. No problem.
Thank you, Ruth. Any other comments from around the table? No? Cool. Can I thank everybody for, and I'll take by the lack of comments that we note the paper. It would be useful, I think, and both in the context of this item and possibly subsequently when we're talking about the business committee, that the point Mark's just raised in relation to local authorities is noted. I just want to reiterate Ruth's point that recognising that it is difficult to anticipate all risks, so we have some uncertainty over settlement. But I think what we're not seeing is any complacency around that, and that we are leaning into those processes and trying to address them. So if there are no further comments, I'll move on. Thank you very much indeed. The next item, I'd like to bring in Rhian for the report, as Rhian is chair of the Welsh Food Advisory Committee. So over to you, Rhian.
Thank you, Tim. So it's a pleasure to present the report from WFAC. It's a tale of two parts because half of the reporting period there was Peter Price was the chair of the committee, and so I'd like to thank Peter for all his work while he was chairing the group. I came into the role from 1st of September, so the latter 6 months have been on my watch, so to speak. Please take the report as read. The first part just sets out what WFAC is about and our membership, and you can have a look at that if you'd like. But really, I wanted to talk about the themed meetings that we have. So WFAC have 4 themed meetings a year. That's the format. Making sure at least one of those is away from Cardiff, somewhere else in Wales, so we can have a look at other facilities and hear from other stakeholders. So during the period, there have been 4 themed meetings. The topics have been the border target operating model back in May 23, local authority operations then in July, and then since I've been with the committee, we've covered science and innovation in Aberystwyth in October, and then most recently regulated product reform. And these meetings are really our chance to do a deep dive on these particular topics and to hear from from stakeholders and sort of flesh out our own understanding. And they're very valuable. And one important point is we've been working quite hard to plan these themed meetings so that we get to have discussions ahead of FSA policy development. That's really important. And I think a good example has been the regulated product reform piece, where we got a chance to turn that over very thoroughly. And I recognise some of the information and proposals in the documentation for board. It echoes from those WFAC meetings, so that's the way it should be. So those are the meetings we've had, and I hope also what you might see in the report, which may not have come through in past reports, is for each of those themed meetings, I'm trying to get a little thread, not just of what we did, but what we thought and what our points of view are. Now, obviously, we can't put too much into this short report, but that's what I'm keen to do, is actually get the WFAC thoughts into our board narrative. Because we're doing two things. We're putting the Wales point of view and nuances into this board discussion, and we're also supporting the discussions and dialogue between Welsh Government and the FSA as well. So supporting ministers as they think about the sort of decisions they need to take for Wales. We want to assure them that WFAC have considered these points and can advise if needed. So I think that's it. The remainder of the report is the forward look, and just a few points of interest, I hope, for you. So in April, our next themed meeting, we're going to be looking at the food business landscape in Wales. And that's because we do really want to thoroughly understand the challenges to businesses in their compliance with what we need them to comply with. And perhaps sometimes there's a temptation to, in the Welsh landscape, because so many of the businesses are smaller businesses, is to forget we do have medium and large size businesses in Wales, and to make sure we are understanding all the points of view. So that's what we'll be doing in April. And one thing I'm keen to explore is Wales, being the sort of size of nation that it is, whether we can offer any opportunities to be a test bed, a location for pilot studies or ways of working which kind of push the boundaries a little bit. I know Welsh Government are looking to see what things we can do in Wales that might, not different for different sake, but actually, are there any progressive approaches we can take and demonstrate them in Wales? So I'm keen to explore that in April. In June, as Susan said earlier, the board are coming to Llandudno in North Wales. I'm really pleased about that. It's a beautiful part of the world. It will be worth the journey, I promise you. And I'm liaising with the team now to see what sort of site visits we can do. There's some really interesting food businesses and operations in that locality, particularly ones that illustrate farm diversification, for example, where, land managers, land holdings have kind of said, well, this is our farming operation, but actually we need to go into this kind of product or service delivery. So we might get a chance to see some of those. And I think I'll just conclude, Chair, just by saying it's really important that WFAC, that I encourage WFAC, and indeed there's no resistance here whatsoever, to engage as widely as possible with our stakeholders regionally. So I am asking WFAC members to represent myself if I can't attend, or even if I can, just to kind of start reaching out to stakeholders as much as possible. We will absolutely be at the Nationalised Eisteddfod, and we'll be at the Royal Welsh Show in the summer months, having as many meetings as we can with groups there. And I know I'll be supporting Susan in her efforts there as well. And welcome any suggestions for how we can continue that engagement with stakeholders as widely as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. That sounds really quite exciting. And so I want to just open out to the rest of the board to make any comments or observations. Fiona.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Rhiannon. It's a small point, really. Your themed meeting that's coming up in April to discuss with food businesses the challenges to compliance and so on. a request that perhaps they could also consider how FSA on a national scale operates, not just within the Welsh context, and how that might contribute to our forward strategic work that we're doing. It'd be really interesting just to get some feedback there. Thank you.
Any other comments? Oh, thank you. David.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, you asked, Rhian, if there were any things Wales were doing which could be replicated elsewhere in England. And there was something we saw maybe last time or second last time, we had a meeting in Cardiff. And that was, I think it was in Cardiff University. They had a system where they had a show kitchen. And I know if someone, say, deep in the valleys had invented some new food product, it's difficult to get the Marks and Spencers or the big supermarkets of this world to go there to see it. And they laid on a system whereby they could come to this show kitchen in Cardiff University and they could demonstrate the product. And we saw someone, I think, who was growing oats way up in the valleys, and he was trying to convert it into oat milk, and he could go to Cardiff in the university facilities there and demonstrate to the supermarkets what he'd got. And I thought that was a rather good system we could copy in England. And maybe in Leeds itself, in the university, there's a big food section there, or something else in Bristol. If you can find out any more about that, I think it was Cardiff University had it, or a food section there, then I'd like to see it, and maybe we could pass it on to DEFRA and say this is something you could replicate in 2 or 3 regions of England to make it easy for the big food manufacturers to go there and see a product.
Thank you for that. Any other comments? Well, can I thank Rhian? I mean, I think 2 or 3 really important points came out of that. Not least the good work that Rhian is doing with the committee, but also, and there's a reciprocal, I think, approach in terms of what Wales can offer back to the national strategy. And perhaps in the context of Llandudno, thinking what we might experience there, particularly in the farm to fork type scenario, because I think one of the great benefits around Wales is the composite of small, innovative businesses who are working both from direct agriculture through to retail. And I think our experience of that will help us understand our regulatory role. And therefore how we can adapt and accommodate within that. So I think that's really important. And equally, Fiona's point around us, I think, understanding better where what is being done nationally gives economy and benefit back to Wales. And I think thinking about the economy of approach there is really important. So I think there's a lot to learn. I think my other point around the smaller businesses and where that impacts on our influence with other government departments like DEFRA underscores David's point. So I think much to look forward to and really reassuring. Thanks very much for that. Right, at this stage, we have to do a quick 2-step because I need to report as chair of the business committee. And so I'm going to pass the chairing of the item to Anthony Harbinson.
Thank you, Tim. Much appreciated. And I will now pass back to Tim to actually present his paper.
As I said, a quick 2-step. Okay, so business committee. So this was since my appointment as FSA deputy chair, I took on the role of the chair of the business committee. Thanks to Mark for caretaking it in the interim role. And I did that earlier this month. So what I'm just going to do is not read out the rather comprehensive report, you'll be pleased to hear, but just to give a brief summary from that meeting. So the written report from the committee is as I say, quite comprehensive. And the highlights I just wanted to pick up were around the financial control targets, in particular, that we did focus on how closely we'd been able to work towards those targets. There was a relative to our budget small underspend, but we did recognise the skill it takes to try and move the rather large tanker of our spending into port sometimes. But that doesn't stop us from really interrogating how we can improve things to be better. So we did focus on staffing costs. We focused on the reward scheme for staff. and also the timely progress and initiation of projects. And I think that'll be an ongoing aspect of the Business Committee going forward. We also looked at incidents and did see and understand the value of increased intelligence post-Brexit with our own systems that had been necessitated because there was some uncertainty about our continued access to the rapid alert scheme for food and feed. And we now see a situation, I think, where they have a complementary value to us. And I think we're seeing that in the way we're mitigating the risk around incidents. I won't labour the point around local authority delivery. We've touched on it a number of points in the board today, and Mark's picked up on it earlier. I think there is an issue around what we can reasonably do as the FSA. Local authorities are in an invidious position in relation to resources and having to prioritise. But nonetheless, we have to ensure and continue to assure that statutory responsibilities are being met. And I think there's been robust work done by the FSA in trying to ensure that is the case. But it is a watching brief, and the Business Committee will continue to keep a focus on that. Equally, around regulated products, we've had a very good discussion around that today. And it will be a continued focus for the Business Committee. So I think that says enough. Any questions or comments around the written report, I'd be happy to take.
Thank you, Tim. I'll throw it open. A couple of hands. I think Mark and then Margaret.
Thanks, Anthony, and thank you, Tim. I did want to focus on the local authority situation, having looked at the slides that the Business Committee saw. All of the RAG-rated performance targets for local authorities are rated as red. That is clearly of great concern to us. But I also wanted to reflect on what we heard last night. We had some visitors last night who are at the cutting edge, I suppose, of local authority delivery. And they explained to us in terms which were quite stark some of the challenges that local authorities face. Local authorities, we have recognised for a number of years, are absolutely critical delivery partners in ensuring that food is safe and is what it says it is. One of our visitors last night, a very senior manager in this space, actually had a couple of asks of us as the FSA, which would, in his view, help managers like him make the case for the adequate resources that they need. And I'm going to paraphrase what he asked for. But he asked for effectively a model service definition, and I know we are doing some work in that space. But then he also asked for improved audit of local authorities, presumably against that model service definition. I know that we do auditing, but if we are in a space where we recognise that local authority delivery is a significant risk for us, and it is significantly important to delivery of safe and properly described food, then I would ask really whether we think the resources we are putting into that auditing are adequate to mitigate that risk. And in terms of that kind of model delivery setup, that is something local authorities are used to. There are other services where there is a model service specification, and it's really helpful to those local authorities to understand what they need to put into it. So my ask really is that we progress that model service delivery work really urgently, and that we review the resources that we're putting into the auditing of that work.
I'll take Margaret's questions and then we'll pass them on to Tim.
Yes, I just noticed Katie's probably, or Emily's, might be best placed to respond in relation to the model service definition. I just suggest we don't have the debate that we'd have in Business Committee here, but it'd be useful just to get an update. Thanks.
Okay. Katie, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you. And I think it's worth saying that the data the Business Committee saw is the same data that the board looked at in December. So we've already had quite a substantive discussion about that performance data at the board. Yes, one of the things that we are doing for local authorities is developing a model the amount of resource that we think would need to be allocated to provide an adequate service. It's not straightforward because all local authorities have a different setup and a different business footprint. But we hope that it would help food teams make the case for resources. On the audit, we have a small number of auditors. We just have a few people who go out and do audits, but we are doing them, and that they are turning up issues on occasion, and where they do, those local authorities are being fed into our performance management process. But I think it's worth saying that that's one part of the work that we are doing with individual local authorities to enable them to make the case for resources and to improve their services. And actually our performance management system as a whole, which gathers data from all the local authorities, picks up quite a lot of issues, and we work very intensively with those local authorities who are in the performance management process. And I was really pleased to be able to update the Business Committee on a few cases where that process had then resulted in local authorities being given more resources to their food teams to improve the service. So audit is a part of that, but it's not the only part. And actually we're devoting quite a lot more resource across the piece on achieving the kind of outcomes that our guests spoke about last night.
Sorry, Margaret, just before I come to you, Emily, did you want to come on that?
To supplement what Katie said by just observing that we do sort of per local authority have a higher number of auditors in Wales and Northern Ireland than we do in England, because the grant that we're given from the Welsh Government and from the Northern Ireland Executive enables us to fund more auditors. So I think English local authorities are less audited by us than Welsh and Northern Irish district councils and local authorities. I therefore think that's something that ARAC may want to turn to, and I think it would be helpful in the context that Katie describes of all of the other interventions we're doing. I think it would. We did look at this question a few years ago in ARAC, but I think it's probably time to come back to it as one of the potential mitigations.
Thank you, Emily. Margaret?
My points are far less important. I really mean that. It's just a case of duplication. Just looking at your report, Tim. I'm the board member responsible for incidents, and a whole load of stuff that on incidents came in various items up to that committee. So, if ever needed, I'd appreciate an alert. But also, maybe we need to have a rethink about, because what will happen is that I will have to have a separate briefing from incidents, and that's a complete waste of their time, duplication. And in fact, it also happened on regulatory products. I was offered a briefing, I assume because I was not across it for that very reason, so was somebody else. So we just need to think about how we deal with that type of thing. 'Cause the one thing we can't be doing is wasting exact time. And also, by the way, duplication, I assume that's something you and Anthony sort out on things like vets, which do go to ARAC as well as business.
Yes, it's an issue I'll pick up in a few minutes. Any other? Fiona?
Thank you. I did just want to come back to local authorities. Given that there was no data update to the Business Committee last time, just to ask Katie to comment on some of the stuff that's going on workforce. Yesterday we went to Leeds Hallam University. They're unique in the UK in that they provide a whole suite of training and qualifications programs for environmental health officers. But they're struggling to actually get students to come through the system. So there's an important strategic piece of work that's being done by the team there that's making progress, and that includes apprenticeships. So I just wondered if you could cover that and also comment on any of the responses that we've had to the right round that you did to the heads of council. Thank you.
Okay, Katie?
Yes, certainly. So since we had the board meeting in December, Emily has written to all the chief executives of local authorities to remind them of their statutory responsibilities on food and feed. And we've had some anecdotal feedback from teams that has helped them to have the internal discussions they're having about resourcing as well. And it has been noted and welcomed. I've spoken about performance management and what we're doing, but there's the work with individual local authorities, but there are 3 other areas where we're trying to do what we can to help, conscious that we cannot solve the problem of local authority resourcing alone. And the first is helping to ease the workforce challenges where we can. So the board will remember we did some research on local authority capability and capacity. And as a result of that, we set up a project which is addressing some of the barriers that were identified in that research and that we actually heard about yesterday on our visit as well. So we are looking at our competency framework to make sure it is no more onerous than it needs to be, whilst continuing to ensure that we have suitably competent people keeping people safe. We're about to start a process of engagement events with local authorities on the changes to that. We've got changes in our food hygiene project going on to enable regulatory support officers to do more work, which again we heard was a challenge yesterday because people who were training weren't able to take on very much work in food teams while they were doing so. We've been working with the Association of Chief Trading Standards Officers and the CTSI to create a new Level 6 apprenticeship scheme, which has been really successful so far. 96 apprentices have joined the scheme and 87 specialise in food and feed. And we think there is a lot more work that can be done to support apprenticeships in the system. And we are working closely with both the chartered institutes on the workforce challenges. And Bex Kirk, who leads on this area on my team, and Karen McCluskey went and presented to the Local Government Association, to elected representatives as well, to their Safer and Stronger Communities Board, and got a lot of support for what we were doing and encouragement for them to look at more flexible vocational qualifications. So we are trying to both fix the bits that are within our direct control, but also trying to convene and work with others on the workforce pipeline challenges. And then the final piece of the puzzle is what will come back to the board in June, which is our continuing to progress thinking about longer term reforms and how to make the service sustainable in the longer term. And we are trying to engage with colleagues across government who have other areas of local authority regulation to sort of collaborate on solving these challenges together. So there is an awful lot of work going on it, and I'm grateful for the board's focus on it.
Thank you, Katie. Any other questions, points, issues? Tim?
Yeah, I'll just respond. I think the local authority aspect has been really well covered, but it is going to be an area of continued attention, and I'm going to ensure that with Kate I get a closer view of what's going on as well outside of the meeting. So Mark's points are not lost, and the other points made around the table. We need to keep this in our field of vision, but I think also the opportunity for making the case on behalf of local authority resources, and I accept Emily's point as well about the difference between England and the other territories. We need to think whether there's anything that we can add to that debate and exert our influence. I didn't want to lose Margaret's point around the style of working between the Business Committee, ARAC, and indeed the key interests of non-execs. It is something fresh in my mind, I think, from being a new chair, but also having been the chair of ARAC. I think the Business Committee, there is still scope for characterising and defining its role, about ensuring that we're getting the best inputs from across the directors, so that when we actually consider an item, even though some of those directors will not necessarily be there because we want efficient and effective use of time, we know that the broader points they could have brought to the table have been thought about ahead. So thank you, Margaret, and we'll work out ways to try and do that without people feeling they're having to duplicate between committees unnecessarily. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Tim. I think you've pretty much done the summing up that I was going to do anyway, but that's the difference of having two chairs at the same time. What I would say is I do think we have discussed and agreed our governance paper today, which sets that, but I do think there is a level of duplication between individual member interests, between ARAC, between Business Committee and the main board, and we just need a bit further clarity going down. We will all have interests in local authorities. We will all have interest in funding, staffing, etc. going forward. So there is a necessary overlap. I just think we need to make sure that we minimise it and we aren't rehashing the same areas over and over again. And one of the things I'm particularly keen that we try to avoid is putting pressure on the executive team to do different papers in the same areas where we can. We should be sharing the same information, the same paper, and doing it once, one and done would be the best way to take this forward. But thank you for that. I'll not say anything more because I'll be picking up some of it in the next paper anyway, so I'll pass back to Tim at this point.
Thanks for that. Yes, sorry, we were definitely double banking on the chairing there. And here we go again, because Anthony's now going to give us a report from ARAC. But I think it does bear repetition that we're trying to see this as one pipeline of activities rather than duplication. So over to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Tim. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through what you've got in the report there. It's very clear, it's very concise. The bits I think that are worth picking up were the points that Ruth has made earlier and we've already touched on. Ruth gave us an update on resources, headcount, people. We do have the funding this year going forward, but there is no certainty about what comes at the end of March next year. And there is difficulties and there will be decisions that we will need to make throughout that period. So it will be a difficult period going forward. We did have a focus on sustainability and it's there for you to see, and something I think we do have a real focus on. But we had the update from the NAO. We had our accounts signed off. Everything went very well and that was very good. Unfortunately, we're a little bit behind again in that catching up with the backlog from COVID. The NAO hasn't been able to provide us the main papers that we were expecting for the March ARAC, which we will take in June, which will be their plan for how they're actually going to conduct their audit going forward. But we're working very well with them and we've built some very good relationships with them, I think, in the last few weeks going forward as well. The internal audit is progressing very well and we've agreed the strategy plan for the incoming year, 24-25. What we did focus on was the regulatory progress report and draft plan, and also then the regulatory report on microbiological criteria sampling and testing. It was good to see those and we questioned the papers on those coming forward. But really where we were also looking was the deep dives, and I think this is one of the areas of overlap that we need to look at. So for example, the areas for deep dive that we were considering was local authority, financial risk and funding. And Emily's letter, I think, has helped a lot of people refocus what their statutory roles and duties are, and even in Northern Ireland, as chair of NIFAC, people have been coming and thanking us for that letter, which has helped reframe elected members' views of what their responsibilities are. We also are going to have a look at regulated products as a deep dive, and we'll consider that, but also the issue perhaps of business continuity. So we'll want to actually look and see the timings of those and see how we can fit them in best with our normal audit plan. Each year we've decided we'll do one of these meetings in person, and last year we did it in November. I think this year we're going to aim for June and do it at that time, because there'll be a lot of bilateral meetings we can do in conjunction with the NAO. So all in all, short agenda this time round, good meeting, good focus, and looking forward to what comes. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Are there any questions around the table? Fiona.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, Anthony. Just a request, if you're, we do have the opportunity to join your ARAC meetings every now and again. If you're going to do one on LAs, I'd like to join that, please. Thank you.
Yes, there's always a standing invitation for anyone to come along. So more than happy, and you will see the agendas in advance.
Thanks for that. I think I'd only one thing. Sorry, was anybody else? The one thing I did want to pick up on, just in summary, was the really pleased to hear about the deep dives and the focus. One of the things that picked up in your report was about sustainability, and I think maybe in the future there's an opportunity to look more deeply at what we're doing around sustainability. It tends to be used as a sort of bit of a throwaway sometimes, rather than necessarily looking more proactively into it, and I guess ARAC would be good to test some of that. Good. If there are no other comments, thank you for that item, Anthony. And nice segue, because we can move directly from that to your role in terms of the Food Advisory Committees. So if we take Anthony first and then Rhiann. Thank you.
There you go. On a roll today. Yes, NIFAC, a quick update. We had our January meeting was a themed meeting, and we focused on regulated products, which I think really helped coming into the discussion here today. And it was good to have that before the papers were actually presented to board, because it gave us a chance to feed in the Northern Ireland context, the Northern Ireland view. We also have our normal meeting last week where we went through the board papers, which was good. But last week we also ran an event on nutrition and vending machines, which I thought was very good and attracted quite a lot of attention. And the chair kindly came across and summarised the endings and presented some papers for us as well. But the team did an outstanding job. I attended the Northern Ireland Food and Drink Awards dinner last Friday night, where again we were making an award on behalf of the FSA, which was good. And I'll attend the Ulster Farmers Union dinner this Friday. I'm eating and drinking for the FSA as we go forward. Only water I should have drink, but there you go. But what I should say is that we interviewed for new NIFAC members. We will be losing 3 this year, and my thanks to them for all the work and dedication they've shown over the last 3 years. And we'll have 3 new members starting on the 1st of April. So all in all, we're in a good position going forward.
Fantastic. That sounds very helpful and also great fun from the sounds of things. So thanks for that. Any other comments on Anthony's report? If not, I'll move to Rhiann. Rhiann.
Thank you, Tim. Just a couple from me, building on the report, the annual report. So in terms of WFAC membership, we've got 2 members that are coming to the end of their terms this year. And so we'll be looking at our skills matrix and just making sure we are covering the range of skills that we need to, so we can turn over all the topics. So it's always an opportunity, and will be a chance to thank those members for their time on the committee when that moment comes. So that's the membership. And Anthony and I, just to say, we're both still engaged in the piece of work to review the food advisory committees and how they work in alignment. So we coordinate the themes of the meetings that we might cover, so that we can come to this board with the views of our collective colleagues. And that's a big step forward, because it's not trivial to try and align with the dates and all the topics that are flying around, but we are doing it. So that feels like a really good place to be. And with that, there is a piece of work going on in the background on the terms of reference for the food advisory committees. It's in train at the moment, but it's good to flesh out and update those terms of reference. And so little may travel to this board in due course on that piece of work. But thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Any comments arising from Rhiann's report? Thanks very much, Rhiann. So with that item, that brings us to the end of formal business, and we have any other business item. I haven't been notified of any other business, but I'll just quickly ask members of the board if there's anything they needed to raise. No? So we can move on to the question and answer session. And I'm now going to turn to members of the public who have kindly joined us today and who've been very patient listening to all our discussions. I hope you found the board business helpful and very worthwhile use of your time. So I'd like to ask if you've got any questions. There's the opportunity to ask them now. And if you do have questions, please could you say who you are and what organisation you're from, or any other affiliation you might have, to preface your question. Thanks very much. Can I take the gentleman in the glasses and the lady to the side of him next, please?
Hi, Stephen Jacobs, Organic Farmers and Growers. We all met before. I've been to a few of these. Thank you very much. Really interesting, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to come along. I wanted to point out there's a small, perhaps, context error in James's report. The legislative consent memorandum in Wales wasn't laid. It was tabled and rejected. Just point that out.
Thank you.
So we operate the organic regulation across all of the devolved nations from across England, but also Wales, Scotland, and most importantly now, for you to understand, in Northern Ireland. Because in Northern Ireland, yes, there's the Windsor Framework and the protocol, but also we operate the organic regulation under the EU regulation. So we will have some additional challenges with PBOs because DEFRA have told everybody, including the Food Standards Agency, that PBOs will be deemed as GMOs as far as the organic regulations are concerned. So we have to deal with food, not just farming, but food products, because I know that in answer to one of my questions in a previous meeting, the FSA said farming's out of scope. Well, organic covers farming, but it also covers food and feed. So it's just around how we can work with you, work with DEFRA, work with colleagues in Northern Ireland in order to make sure that we can protect supply lines. All we need is transparency of information. And I just want to highlight, we're a government-regulated body. So I'm not coming with some kind of commercial interest or an emotive interest. I work as a government-regulated body. My responsibility is to the licensees. So the question really is, can we please put our heads together to help James and his team, to help us, to help the local authorities, who are the police in this respect, enable the Genetic Technology Act to be rolled out safely for commercial operators across all of the regions of the UK.
Can I thank you very much for that question? It's an incredibly important issue to be addressed, and I don't know if officials would want to say anything now. Rebecca.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you very much for your question, and thanks for the point of clarification on the legislative point. That's noted, and I totally agree. I'm really grateful for the way in which we've been able to engage with the organic sector so far, and absolutely agree that we need to continue to do so as we go forward, because it's important, as you say, that we get this right, and that particularly the enforcement around it as well. So absolutely happy to keep that engagement going.
Thank you, Stephen. That's really helpful. And can I take a question from the lady to the side of you?
Thank you. My name's Leonie. I work for GM Freeze. Yeah, I've got quite a few questions actually, but I will maybe just ask one or two and see how we're doing. I'm somewhat taken aback by the fact that you're not discussing the potential impact of the vote in the European Parliament to require labelling and traceability of what over there is referred to as products developed using new genomic techniques. What, if any, risk modelling has the FSA conducted for a scenario where Europe requires labelling and traceability and the UK does not? I note that Europe is developing detection methods, but the FSA has decided not to. And also that the impact assessment for the genetic technology precision breeding bill states, non-tariff barriers that might result from different regimes in different places wouldn't only affect products exported which contain so-called precision bred plant material, but also products from the same product categories that do not. So this is a potentially huge impact on British producers, and the same impact assessment, estimated the market to be worth 8.5 billion a year. And I just, I'm kind of aghast that you're not really, I think this is your first meeting since that vote happened, and, I'd like to know why you're not talking about this.
So thank you very much for that. A few things in there. I think, again, you raise a really important point. There's quite a lot, obviously, to still resolve in this area as we go forward, and we recognise that. But I'll turn to officials and see if there's a comment. And again, it'd be Rebecca, I think, who's in the hot seat.
Yes, thank you very much. And again, thank you to you, Leonie, and to your colleagues for engaging with us as well throughout the process. And I know we've had a lot of dialogue previously about some of these issues. Of course, we are keeping in close touch with developments in the EU, and that is of interest to us. I think that there's still some way to go before those proposals are finalised, and so we'll wait and see what is decided. But you're right; it's important that we understand the impact on what is still quite an integrated market, and so we'll respond once we know more. Just going back to detection methods, I wouldn't say that we have ruled it out. I think that given the work that we did to look into this, we didn't feel that there was a scientifically robust approach that we could be using at this stage. Of course, if that changes, and including if the EU come up with some proposals that give us some new evidence there, then yes, of course, we'll look at that. So at the moment, it's not something that we're taking forward because we don't think that those methods are available currently.
Go ahead, Leonie. Just one last question, and then we'll.
Yes, I guess if you don't invest in those detection methods, then they're much less likely to be available going forward.
I think it's a valid point, and there's quite a lot of scientific issues around the detection methods, which I don't necessarily think we want to get into now. But perhaps, Rebecca, if you want to have a chat with Leonie when we conclude the meeting, just so that Leonie can be, some of the questions can be addressed. Thank you very much indeed. Are there any other questions? If not, can I just thank everybody for their participation and the quality of conversation and discussion around the table today, and also the questions that have come from the floor, which have been enormously helpful. And with that, thanks. Oh, sorry, Margaret.
Tim, just sort of pointing out that some of these questions are quite interesting for the board, and that the answers to them will come to the board as well, yeah? So
really, really helpful, yes. So, they have all been listened to, and I think we see them in a constructive light. So they do give us some food for thought, as well as, I think, underscore things that we ourselves have concerns about, even if you haven't heard us necessarily surface those concerns around the board table today. Thank you very much indeed. On that point, I will conclude the meeting. Thank you very much.